This is Jocko podcast number 481 with Echo Charles and me, Jocko Willink. Good evening, Echo.
Good evening.
In January 2006, I stepped off a C-130 in Tal Afar, Iraq. As I began my 13-month deployment, I imagined an American public following our progress with the same concern as my family and friends. But since returning home, I've seen that America has changed the channel. Young investment bankers spend their impressive bonuses on clubs in Manhattan, and many seem uninterested in the soldiers fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a Princeton graduate and former financial analyst, I was once part of this world, and I like returning to it, putting the Spartan life of Tal Afar and Anbar Province behind me. But even as I enjoy time with friends who have welcomed me home, my thoughts wander back to other friends who continue to fight as the city parties on. Serious problems with the war in Iraq are well chronicled, but I am struck by one that does not seem to trouble the country's leadership, even though it is profoundly corrosive to our common good. The disparity between the lives of the few who are fighting and being killed and the many who have been asked for nothing more than to continue shopping. Those who rationalize this disconnect have argued that our soldiers are volunteers, happy doing what they signed up to do. While it is true that most soldiers are devoted to country and comrades and are focused on their mission, the assertion that soldiers are cheerfully returning for multiple combat tours is grounded in statistics and arguments that are misleading. Supposedly impressive re-enlistment rates are cited as evidence that soldiers enthusiastically support the war effort. In reality, these retention numbers are more the result of the stop-loss policy, where soldiers are required to remain in the Army after their contracts have expired if their units are deployed or ordered to deploy soon. My platoon's infantrymen expected to be stop-lossed, and some felt they might as well cash in on the re-enlistment bonuses if they were going to be forced to stay in the Army anyways. Few of today's soldiers expected 15-month deployments separated by home stays of less than 12 months. The stress on Army families is enormous, especially since at least 4 of those months at home are generally spent training in the field. Sacrifices like these were the norm in World War II, and families left behind could draw strength from the military knowledge, from the knowledge that everyone is in the same situation. Today's military families shoulder this burden pretty much alone. Never in my life have I seen such commitment, with soldiers and officers working in hazardous conditions upward of 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for over a year, barely able to pause long enough to commemorate their fallen friends. Meanwhile, in the banking houses of New York, the shaky credit markets and the Dow are the things that matter. The problems facing our soldiers 8,000 miles away seem to capture little attention. And that right there is an article from the New York Times in 2007, and it was written by Will Bardenwerper, who is a former Airborne Ranger, qualified infantry officer who served in Iraq with the Ready 1st Brigade combat team of the 1st Armored Division. He was a college athlete, a presidential management fellow, a master's in international public policy from Johns Hopkins, and a degree in English from Princeton. He's written articles for Outside Magazine and a variety of newspapers, and he's written 2 books. The first one called The Prisoner in His Palace, Saddam Hussein, His American Guards, and What History Leaves Unsaid. And he has a new forthcoming book, which is called Homestand, small town baseball and the fight for the soul of America. And it's an honor to have him with us here tonight to share some of his experiences and lessons learned. Will, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think so. We got hooked up through General McFarland, who said you were one of the most interesting men alive. And as I read through your bio and what you've written and what you've done, that he was certainly a very interesting life you've led thus far.
No, thank you again for having me. And I guess Colonel Sean McFarland at the time, who I worked with in Iraq, was one of, and I know you've worked with him closely. I enjoyed your discussion with him, and as we both know, just a fantastic leader and a fantastic human being. So it was an honor to work with him back then.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So let's get some background on you and growing up. What was that all about?
My childhood, I think, is probably maybe less dramatic or less exciting than some of the other guests you've had. I'd classify it as kind of your typical, middle class, upper middle class, suburban childhood outside Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. Oldest of 5 kids. My father was a lawyer. My mom was busy raising the 5 of us.
Was your dad Ivy League?
No, he wasn't.
Okay, because you guys ended up sending every kid went to an Ivy League school in your family? I think
so. I was the first in our family to do that, and then the younger 4 followed in my footsteps. So I think all he has to show for it is just a lot of debt that that he took on and that he shared with us. But no, it was a great childhood. I went to a Catholic elementary school, was taught by nuns, and despite some of the stories you hear, actually I had a good experience doing that. I learned a lot.
I've had some people on that went to Catholic schools as kids, and they said they were their Catholic nuns were harsher than their most harsh drill sergeants. So
no,
sounds like you had a better experience.
Yeah. No, you hear the stories about getting your knuckles wrapped with rulers and stuff, but no, we didn't experience any of that. It was a good.
Did
education.
you inherit any of the? Did you inherit any of the firstborn kind of stereotypical, like, are you a hyper rule follower? Are you aiming to please? Are you kissing up to the boss? Is that your gig?
Maybe a little bit of that. I don't know. My parents may, push back on the rule following, but I think I kind of was like that. I was a hard worker. I was incredibly competitive, from childhood, athletically and academically in the classroom. I'm sure I inherited a little bit of that from my parents, and then some of it was probably just natural. But no, I think that there was an element of that probably going on. Was there veterans who had served in your family? Both of my grandfathers served in World War II, and we'll get into this probably in a little bit, but I think thinking back on their experiences did play a role in my motivation to ultimately join the military for sure. Did
they tell you stories when you were growing up or anything?
They did. Their experiences were very different, and their personalities were very different. My mom's father served in the Army Air Corps, and my father's father served in the U.S. Navy, and so he was in the Pacific during the war. And then my mother's...
Is he still alive?
No, they've both passed. They actually both, I think, passed when I was in Iraq, as a matter of fact. Wow. So I lost both of them when I was over there.
I haven't found a sailor, a World War II sailor. I haven't had a World War II sailor on this podcast, and those guys that were fighting in either theater, but just what being in the Navy was like in 1943, waiting to get torpedoed, waiting to get kamikaze attacked. The grit that those guys had was crazy.
It's amazing. It's funny you mentioned that. My father was just visiting my grandma. His wife is now 101, still alive, living on her own in Louisville, Kentucky. Amazing lady. And my father was just there a week or two ago, and he was going through some of my grandfather's diaries from the war. And he took screenshots of a few passages from it. And it's just like you said. And it's not only, I guess, I had always imagined what it might be like to be worried about, a submarine coming after you or some kind of combat. But just the daily life of being out at sea. And that's something we don't even think about. But he talked about how there was this one storm, I think it was actually off the coast, maybe not too far from here, LA or San Diego. And, the waves were so intense that they were knocking out the windows on the bridge of the ship. And he was talking about how there were guys who, spent, 36 hours basically just, vomiting into trash cans and stuff. And, and I think sometimes that gets overlooked. We think about the combat element, but just being out there under those conditions, let alone that there might be enemy nearby, and the fact that they didn't know that when this was going to end. It wasn't like nowadays where it's like, okay, you got your 12-month or whatever deployment. That was just, you're out there until we win or lose.
Yep, you're going on deployment until we win, and that's that. And so, when you were growing up, what were you doing? I know you were into sports. So what sports? What were your sports?
It was kind of you think about the movie Sandlot, or kind of your conventional, childhood back then, kind of the end of that era where kids would just go to the playground with their buddies, and play games. So it was just whatever season you happened to be in. Football, you go play football all day. Baseball, you do baseball. Basketball was kind of, year round to some extent. And we just had our little neighborhood posse of kids. We go out there, and it was great. I think it was great development because a lot of my good friends were older, and so you're playing football and you're just getting your butt kicked, by guys that are 4 or 5 years older than you are, a lot bigger and stronger. So then when it comes time to play against kids your age, it doesn't seem so intimidating because you're used to that. So that's what we would do. We'd go out there, and then I was always a hard worker at school. My parents kind of instilled that in me. So always, spent a good amount of time doing homework and things like that.
And so then you end up going to private high school as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Catholic, Jesuit, all male high school down not too far from the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Took the metro, the subway down there, as a freshman in high school. Fantastic.
Daily commute?
Yeah, daily commute.
Okay.
Yep. Go to baseball practice and then ride home on the subway in your baseball uniform on the way home. Back then, the neighborhood was a little sketchier. It's gotten gentrified since then, but the education's always been fantastic. Really good, history, English. I think that helped kind of foster in me the love of reading. So I have, nothing but good things to say about that experience.
And did you have a plan of what you wanted to do? Like, your parents weren't Ivy League, but somehow you decided that you were going to go to the best school you could get into?
That's part of it. I'd like to think it was sort of more sophisticated than that, but in reality, I think it was part of that competition. And, there were a handful of kids in the class like me who were always, vying to get the top grades, and kind of the goal for that was to get admitted to, one of the more competitive schools. And so that's kind of how I, ended up applying to those schools.
Was your high school like a feeder school?
No, I wouldn't. It was fantastic education, but it wasn't, like one of these prep schools where, half the class goes to the Ivy League.
You know what that is, Echo Charles? What? A feeder school?
Of course.
I don't think they do it anymore, but like when I was a kid, there was prep schools up in New England where if you went to this prep school, they would just feed right into Ivy League schools. Obviously you had to do well and you couldn't be an idiot, but it was a real thing. It was a real thing.
It's that it's whether it's covert or overt, it's kind of part of the program.
Yeah,
like this is the pre kind of phase to go into this other thing.
And that's and when I got to Princeton, I saw that because I was like, wait a second, there's a lot of kids here from Groton or Andover, disproportionate number. But no, I sometimes people will suggest that going there was like a gift or the result of kind of being entitled or whatever, and I do kind of push back against that because I think that negates the fact that I was working like a lunatic all through high school to make this happen, and I was spending 3 hours a day studying when other kids were going out and having a good time, and so I had to sacrifice to make it happen.
So were you listening to music? Were you going out on the weekends? None of that stuff.
No, embarrassingly, I didn't. I didn't have the best social life, and there was a lot of between sports and school. I almost gave myself like an academy-like experience. When you hear about West Point or Annapolis,
self-imposed.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have a ton of fun there either. But mine was just self-imposed. Exactly.
How much of that was just being Catholic?
I don't think that played a big part of it. I think it was more just kind of this competitive nature and wanting to do the best I could.
Now, which sport you excelled in? Baseball?
Baseball was the one I ultimately did. I loved basketball, and I'd like to think that I was a decent player, but I was a 6-foot white suburban kid. I got down to practice actually, or to the tryouts at Gonzaga, and Gonzaga's typically like nationally ranked, top 20 in the entire country. Unbelievable basketball program.
This is Gonzaga High School.
Gonzaga High School.
Not Gonzaga University out in Washington State.
Correct. And I'll never forget, I showed up for the freshman team tryouts. This isn't varsity or JV, this is just freshmen. And, there were like 60 guys there, and a bunch of them are dunking. And I'm thinking to myself, holy cow, I'm lucky if I can touch the net, if I jump. And these guys are like hanging from the rim. And I quickly realized that basketball was not going to be, on my horizon. And that was tough. Everyone's had an experience where it was the first time they were cut from something. And, I remember going to the team, outside the coach's office, and they write the names down of the guys, as the tryouts progress, and my name wasn't on there.
How many cuts did you make?
0. and like I said, I think I was good. Through elementary school, through junior high, I scored like half my team's points. I was a pretty good player, but I'd had no business on the court with the rest of those guys.
What number in the class did you graduate from high school?
Second out of like 160.
Who graduated number 1?
Guy,
or at least have you tracked them? Do you know what they're doing now?
Kareem, I still remember his name. Yeah, we were always battling it out. I think he became a doctor. I think he went to Johns Hopkins. Maybe.
Okay, yeah. Check. Sometimes those people that are number 1, they turn out. The pressure, they break. Yeah. Charles. All right, so you show up at Princeton. So you ended up playing baseball at Princeton?
I did for 2 years. I wasn't recruited. The coach kind of knew who I was, but hadn't made any special, promises to me to make the team, and that was unfortunate because as a non-recruit, you kind of not only do you have to be as good as the person you're competing with, you kind of have to be better because presumably the coach has told that guy and his family, if you come here, you're going to play, whereas he hasn't told me anything. And so, I think as a result, I didn't get the playing time that I would have liked.
Were you a walk-on then?
Yeah,
okay.
you could say that. Yeah, like a walk-on who they kind of knew who he was, but you didn't really have any promises.
And what was your goal being an English major? What did you think you were going to do with your life?
I hadn't given it. Honestly, I went through the course catalog and I just looked at which courses on here seemed to appeal to me the most, and I narrowed it down to history and English. And I could have gone in either direction, and ultimately I chose English. And I really didn't have like a long-term plan for where this is going to lead. Maybe I should have, because a lot of kids do, and they're like, I'm going to do economics, and I'm going to go do this and that, and one thing leads to another. But for me, it was really just intellectual curiosity. I just liked the looks of those courses.
And then when you were at Princeton, did you get involved with the what are they called? Dinner clubs or supper clubs? What are they called?
Eating clubs. Yeah.
Eating clubs. So, Echo Charles, correct me if I'm wrong. Will, at Princeton, they don't have fraternities, but they have these things called eating clubs?
Eating clubs.
And they're kind of like a fraternity because they have a house. And I was speaking at Princeton, and I went to one of the eating clubs. And it seemed like I was in a fraternity, being quite honest with you.
Wait, so you said eat? Wait, is it eat in?
Eating, like eating food. Yeah.
EATING.
Yeah.
Eating clubs.
Yep. Eating
Why
clubs.
do they call it eating clubs?
So, as the best I can describe it is, like you said, it's essentially a fraternity, but with no national affiliation. Now, where they got the name Eating Club, I'm not entirely sure, but each one, kind of like a fraternity, has its own identity. You got your athletes in this one, your sort of party animals in this one, your artsy people in this one. They're all now co-ed. I think mine was the last one to admit women sometime, shortly before I got there. And you do eat there. It's for you join midway through your second year, so it's and that's where you do eat your meals, but it's also where like all the parties and things go on. And so I got involved, maybe too involved, in the tap room of my eating club, which was Tiger Inn, which had a decent number of athletes, but was also kind of one of the wilder ones at the time.
Now, is this because you were partially like cleared hot for the first time in your life to like do something crazy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hear about the, I went through, when I got into the Army, a lot of my training was with the guys who had just gotten out at West Point, and you hear stories about how they kind of go crazy when, because they've spent 4 years not having a typical college experience, and all of a sudden they're free to go out. And that was kind of me, I think, in college. I'd spent my entire high school years working, and so now I was like, oh, wow, there's free beer all the time, girls, so no, I had fun. I still worked, between sports and academics, I still did work really hard, but I had a lot more fun there than I had in high school.
Now, as you start going through Princeton, you're studying English. Did you start to figure out some kind of a plan of what to do with your life?
No, I still, for someone that was as hard of a worker as I was, I really didn't do a great job of looking ahead, as far as, a career, plan of any kind. I don't know why that might be. So, soon enough, it's time to graduate, and I still really didn't know what I wanted to do next. But I knew a few of my good friends were going to medical school, and they were going to take a year off before medical school. They were both from Colorado to go back and basically be ski bums for a year. And then another friend of mine and I just didn't know what we wanted to do, but we thought that sounded fun. So and they had a family friend who was a real estate agent in Vail who could hook us up with a really cheap place to live out there. And so I ended up doing that basically for lack of a better idea of what I wanted to do.
Did your dad try and beat you when he found out that was your post-Princeton plan, was to go be a ski bum?
Yeah, no, they weren't thrilled. I think, I did assure them, listen, this isn't the rest of my life. There's going to be an end point to this. Although a lot of people that go to Vail say that, and I was going to say 20 years later.
Yeah, you go up there and meet some lifties that are 48 years old, and you're like, when did you get here? Oh, 1976, bro.
And there's nothing wrong. I mean, I can see the appeal of that.
Actually, my sister is a ski bum, or she was a ski bum. She's just getting out of that phase of her life right now, and she's a little older. She's a little bit younger than me. But she, I would talk to her, and my dad would always point out, I'd say, well, what's she gonna do? And he's like, well, she skied 114 days last year and 128 days the year before that. And so who's winning? And I'm like, yep, she's winning.
No, I mean,
winning.
I was good friends with the, the ski patrol guys out there, because I did construction in the summer before, doing lift stuff and working at a bar in the winter. And that's what a lot of the ski patrol guys did in the summer, was just work, construction out on the mountain. And, they're great dudes, and their quality of life was fantastic, and they make meaningful contributions. I mean, they're out there every day, on tons of terrain, helping people. So I don't, look down on that at all.
Oh no, that's what I'm saying. I looked at my sister and her whole crew of dirtbags. That's the term used in a positive way. Dirtbags. Dirtbags means you're just gonna. It doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter what kind of gear you have. It doesn't matter where your next paycheck is coming from. What matters is how hard you ski, and are you skiing a lot? And that's the goal. And her and her friends, man, they killed it for many years, many decades, which is pretty impressive.
But that said, after my year there. I think that's when my parents were like, all right, enough. We were supportive of this kind of for a little while, but we didn't help pay for this education for you to be checking IDs and breaking up fights, for the next 10 years. So
what was the next move?
New York, like a lot of Princeton grads, finance was an option, and that's back, late 90s. The markets were doing good. There was an opportunity for an English major like me to get a job. I don't think that would always be the case, depending on how the economy was going. But back then they couldn't fill some of those places quickly enough. So I contacted some people I knew from school, and got a job in equity capital markets in Manhattan. Had a lot of close friends from college there, and so moved there. And I loved it. I loved the city. It was a great time to be a New Yorker. The economy was booming. It was just a lot of fun.
And is this nowadays what it is when you go for that first couple of years being an analyst in one of those investment banks? You're getting ground down. It's 18, 16-hour days and all that. Is that what you were into?
It depends on the job. And so what you're describing, one of my 3 roommates was doing that. He was working at Goldman Sachs, and I'll never forget. I lived with him for a year, and I almost never saw him. And my hours, because of the nature of my job, were demanding, but not like that. I'd say mine was closer to between 8 and 10 at night, which by New York analyst standards is actually very reasonable. So I'd get home, let's say at 10, he'd still be at work. And then I'd wake up, the next morning at 7, and he would have at some point during the night gotten home, probably, slept for a few hours, changed his suit, showered, and was back in the office. So the whole week would go by, I wouldn't see him. The weekend, maybe we'd cross paths on a Sunday afternoon, but he worked pretty much that those same hours on Saturday and part of Sunday. And that was for a year straight. He was probably in the office 360 out of 365 days. And that's like their winnowing process. And if you can stick with it, it can be pretty lucrative, but a lot of people don't.
So why was your job more mellow?
It was more market hours based. So it was more, akin to like the trade-in part of finance than the investment banking deal making part. And those jobs tend to be a little bit less demanding when it comes to hours. So
you're doing that job. So is that the job you're in when September 11th happens?
Correct. Yep. I was, everyone in New York on that day, has their own story or memory of it. And it's funny how similar a lot of them are, but, for some reason everyone always comments, and I'm the same way on like how beautiful of a day it was. And there's something about that I think, really hit people. But yeah, we were working, on a, kind of a trading desk, environment. So just like, communally kind of, a dozen people kind of all together. And we had the TVs turned on to CNBC like we did every morning. And, the first plane hit, and kind of similar to a lot of people, we were like, it must have been some kind of small Cessna that, got off course or something, some kind of an emergency. And then the second one hit, and like a lot of people, it became pretty clear that this is not a coincidence at this point. And at this point, we're all just watching. And we knew people, most of us that were working in the World Trade Center. I think we may have even had a few people from our company, in meetings down there that morning. Our office was in Midtown. But I had friends that worked. My roommate actually worked in the World Financial Center, like right across the street. He remembers seeing people jump in and stuff that, he'll probably never forget. But they evacuated my building because we were, I think, the third highest, skyscraper in Manhattan at the time. They didn't know how many more planes might be inbound. I remember thinking to myself, it's probably not the safest place to be hanging out. At that time, I didn't have any military or first responder experience, so there was really no, it didn't occur to me to like go down there and try to help. I don't know what I could have done at that point anyway. So I just was thinking, I should just try to get out of here safely. So I thought to myself, well, Grand Central is probably not a good place to go. That's kind of another landmark. It could be another target. Same thing with Penn Station. So I'm like, I was dating a girl who lived up in Connecticut, as a matter of fact. And I thought, that's probably a safe place to go. So I remember walking up through Central Park and, I thought to myself, well, no one's going to mess with Harlem. The Harlem train station is not going to be on the top of a terrorist list. So I'll just jump on the Metro North train there, go up to her house and, hang out until this kind of clears out. And I remember turning back and looking down south, to the skyline. And it looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off. The skyline from east to west of the bottom of the island of Manhattan was just all smoke. And at that point, we didn't have, it wasn't like today where you could look on your phone. Since I left the building, I didn't know what had happened down there. As far as I knew, a nuclear bomb had gone off. It looked like it. So that, that was an experience that I obviously won't forget, nor will I'm sure anyone who was there at the time.
At what point did you start thinking about changing your career path?
Pretty much almost right then. It was almost instant. And it wasn't so much, even though I think it was pretty clear, I think the president got on TV like that night or the next day and was talking about how it was a terrorist attack. So it was pretty clear immediately that this was an attack. But it wasn't so much that I felt, I need to go fight or, bring anyone to justice. It was more watching like the FDNY, the NYPD, guys who helped people every day, and the selfless service and the example that they set, going, the firemen going up the stairs into these collapsing towers, watching that and watching the responders, going down to ground zero, in the hours and days afterwards. It just opened my eyes up to something different. And all of a sudden, the Excel spreadsheets I was doing every day just didn't seem fulfilling or important, and so I pretty impulsively quit that job, maybe about a week, again with no plan, no idea, just an abstract desire to find some way to serve somehow. But I did think to myself, if I don't do this now, the emotion will they say not to make emotional decisions, but at the same time, I think in this case, I was convinced this is something I need to do, and if I don't do it now, maybe I won't ever do it. So I quit. And started to research, FBI, FDNY, NYPD, Army, Marines, and ultimately for a variety of reasons, I kind of chose the military. I think partly because a lot of those other things are more career choices. You don't see too many cops or firemen or even FBI agents do it for 3 years and get out. Whereas the military, and I wasn't convinced I wanted to do this for the rest of my life. I just thought this is my time to serve the same way that my grandfathers had. And the military seemed to be the best opportunity to do that with, either you can and then go in two directions. You can stick with it and make it a career, or you can do it and serve honorably and get out and, do whatever comes next.
And Army or Marine Corps?
And so I was leaning actually Marines. A lot of people, I probably just watched the commercials and it looked cool. And, they have the reputation.
That's the Marine Corps.
Yeah, they have the reputation of being, super demanding, and the competitive part of me, I just wanted to do whatever was hardest, and they kind of seemed like their basic training or OCS is the hardest. So that's what I'll do. I didn't really have any interest in flying with my eyesight. I don't think I would have had any aptitude for it. I didn't probably even really know much about, the Navy. I don't think I wanted to be on a ship. I had a sense that this fight's going to be on the ground. I don't even know if I knew really about the SEALs back at that point. The Marines seemed like a good fit. But amazingly, they had, no one was getting out of the Marines at that point. Everyone that had been doing it was like, well, this is what we've been training for years. We're not going to get out. And then they also had a flood of people like me applying. So they said, well, we're not going to be able to process you to OCS for, a year or so. And then so I went to the Army recruiting office, and they're bigger, and they have more slots. And they said, we can get you in more quickly. And so that's the direction I ended up going. How
long did it take before you actually left and in the Army, you, even as an officer, you end up going to boot camp first, right?
Mm-hmm. And that, so and that even ended up taking longer than I expected. I don't think I ended up beginning basic training until like January 2003, which is over a year after 9/11. And that was with the Army, which was supposedly going to be more quick than the Marines. And you're right. The Marine Corps, and I think the Navy, you would know better than I, you can, if you're a college graduate, you can just go to OCS.
Yeah, the Navy, you can do that. Yeah.
And so, the Army, for whatever reason, you got to go to basic training and then OCS. And so it ends up just being like two basic trainings. Yeah, you finish basic training and you get like a day off, and you show up at OCS and you're on the ground doing more push-ups, getting yelled at, and you think to yourself, wait, I thought I was done with this. You're just starting a new one. So that was like 6 months of just hazing. Because OCS was just kind of like a repeat of basic training. And basic training was tough, not so much because of like the physical demands, which, I was in pretty good shape. It wasn't overwhelming. But it was more just culturally, here I am, this 26-year-old guy, coming from this Manhattan job, and most of the kids were like 18. So it was just like, I felt like I was back kind of in high school.
Did they make you like a squad leader or anything?
They did. They give you like, certain leadership things. And I had pretty good drill sergeants, and I actually became, friends with some of the guys in the platoon. And you start to realize, that even though this kid may be 18, there's things that he's pretty good at that you're not good at. I think the guy that graduated #1 in my basic training class was going to join the Army band of all things, and he was the most squared away guy in the whole place.
That's wild. That is wild that I'll meet people like that. Like, oh, I was in the Marine Corps. Oh, I'll say, what'd you do? What'd you do in the Marine Corps? And they were like trombone or whatever. And that's what they do there for their career. Mm-hmm. They'll be in the career in the Marine Corps or in the Navy, and that's their job. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they kind of have to be squared away because you do a lot of drill and ceremony and all that. So was there any level of regret when you were in boot camp or you were in OCS? Like, hold on a second, what am I doing here?
Oh man, yeah. Not an hour would go by where I didn't think that. Because it's when I joined, like a lot of people, I'd watch the commercials. I thought I'd be running around in the woods, doing Army stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, we're just spending hours like making our beds and folding our socks and labeling our T-shirts, and mopping floors, and it was just, it's like, where's the Army? The highlight of my day was the physical fitness, just going for a run and doing push-ups. Like, that's the kind of stuff I loved. But it was, and then not to mention the drill and ceremony and the marching, and I was just like, this isn't what I joined to do, so all of basic training was kind of like that, and then OCS was kind of more of that. I would say that it wasn't until infantry officer school, which is like the next step in the Army pipeline, that I finally was like, okay, this is what I joined for.
How long is the Army infantry officers course?
What was it? It was at least the better, because I joined at the same time that a lot of the West Point grads joined. It just because it just so happened I was going through it. I think we began in July. They graduate in like May or June. Yeah. And most of them go in either the July or the August course. And I think it runs maybe like 5 months, something like that. And I mean, I think there were two elements of it that appealed to me. One was I was finally with like sort of older, more mature guys, that were just kind of more similar to me in background and experience, I think. A lot of them were for whatever reason, former Army, athletes. I was good friends with some hockey players, football players, baseball, lacrosse, so it's just like good dudes to hang out with. And then, finally we were out in the field doing, Army stuff. We had a great, I don't know what we called them, like a training officer. He was a major. He was with 101st Airborne, had just gotten back from an Iraq deployment, and he was in charge of our platoon, training us. He was wonderful, and we just go out in the field for 3-4 days at a time. And finally I was like, okay, this is what it's all about. But there was 6 months there where it was like you said, I was just like, what in the world? Why did I make this decision?
And then from there, it was what? Airborne school and then Ranger school?
Correct. Yeah, I don't remember which order. It must have been Airborne first, because I did some jumps in Ranger school, which you wouldn't do if it was the other way around. So yeah, Airborne school, nothing too crazy. I mean, just it's static line. You just jump out of the plane. That's basically, you just got to overcome that initial fear and take the step. Other than that, it's not too difficult. Ranger
school is a little bit more difficult, though.
Yeah, that one, that was tough. I'm not going to lie. That was certainly to date, and maybe even till now, the hardest thing that I had done. Not everyone that's been through it will say that. Some guys I'm sure get through it, more easily than others. But for me, it was a real challenge.
You ended up writing an article. Maybe we'll refer back to that article. But what was the major challenge for you at Ranger School?
I mean, I think there were a few that are common to everyone, and then a few that were unique to me just because of my skill set. The common ones are kind of the obvious ones, just no sleep. It's 9 weeks, 63 or so days. Usually the first week is kind of in like a garrison setting, and then the second 2 weeks of each phase are in the field. The garrison part, you might get 4 hours of sleep, on a mattress. The 2 ensuing field weeks, it's more like 1 to 2 hours of sleep just on the ground. If it's raining, you're wet. If it's cold, you're cold. If it's hot, you're hot. And that's that'll take a toll in a week or two, much less 9 weeks. And then the food, not eating, you get it's the same thing like the garrison part. That 1 week you'll get at least, I think, 2 meals a day in a chow hall that you get 90 seconds to eat it, so you're just eating with both hands as fast as you can, but you get some calories. And then the field 2 weeks, it's I think 2 MREs a day, which isn't a lot when you're on your feet 20 hours a day. You're burning, I think, twice as many calories as you're taking in. So those 2 things were tough. For me, the sleep part was harder than the food part. Some people, the food part's harder than the sleep part.
How much weight did you lose?
I didn't lose a ton because I did for a period of time, but I recycled, which we can maybe get into in a little bit. And that is an opportunity to kind of fatten yourself back up.
What did you get
again.
Recycled for?
So that ties into your previous question about the challenges. So those were the 2 common challenges. The things that were challenging in particular to me were the fact that I've just never been handy with things. And so, whether it is just like constructing something, like building something, it's kind of embarrassing in our family, my wife's the one that, if we buy a IKEA desk and someone needs to build it, I could sit there for 5 hours with manuals and instructions, and the thing looks all more screwed up after I've touched it than it did before, and she'll take a quick look at it, and it'll be assembled in like 2 seconds. And so that's tough, because a lot of what you're doing at Ranger School is, not constructing things, but tying things down, tying knots. That was ultimately what got me recycled. But, so everything that you're assigned, whether it's your night vision goggles, even like your weapon, any what they call sensitive items, radios and things, you have to tie it down so you don't lose it when you're out in the woods in the middle of the night. And I just, for the life of me, couldn't tie a knot, and one of the things you need to do is pass this test called knots in the mountain phase. And part of it is to do
your biggest fear.
Yeah. And this is something that
specially made for you.
Yeah.
The test is called knots.
and what's even more embarrassing is this is a test that like 95% of the students have no problem with.
Yeah.
It's not considered something that presents much of a challenge to most people who aren't don't have some kind of not dyslexia. And there's 10 of them that you need to do. And part of it's for mountaineering, it's for safety. Like you need to, if you're doing on belay or something and you're going down the side of a mountain, you want to make sure that knot is done correctly so you don't just crash. And there's 10 of them. And I'll never forget, there's like a rope. And you're standing next to it with your little ropes, and you do your knot like on top of that big one, and you have 2 minutes I think to do each one, and then the instructor will come by, and I think you have to get like 8 out of 10, and you have 2 minutes to do it, and he'll say the double bowline, blah, whatever, and if you get it wrong, he'll like tap you on the helmet and you take a knee. And so I remember the first time I did it, he'd announce whatever that knot was. And I just took a knee instantly because I knew. You could give me,
surrender.
You could give me an hour, and it's gonna. All my knots just turned into like what they call a granny knot. No matter what it was, that's what it would ultimately look like. And so he's like, Ranger, what are you doing? You got a minute and 50 left, and I'm like, you could give me the rest of the day, but this isn't gonna happen.
Dang.
And
you got an A+ for honesty. In knots, an A+ for honesty.
And so I might have gotten 4 of them right out of 10, and so that was it. So at that point you're recycled to the beginning of that phase.
You would have really, in SEAL training, you got to tie knots too, underwater on a breath hold.
Oh my God! I can barely tie my shoes, so that would not be in the cards for me. And it stunk because you have to go back to the first day, of that phase. Mm-hmm. All your buddies that you've been going with are moving on. I remember I had to serve them food. You have to do menial labor. So I was working in the chow hall, serving them their food on the day they left to go down to Florida for Florida phase, which was the last phase of Ranger School. And I knew I remember the timing, but I knew there was something that some party or something they were going to. I was thinking to myself, they're going to be at that party having graduated before I even restart this phase, because we were there they take this break for the best Ranger competition. And so the next, you usually would pick up with the next class. The next class wasn't going to come through for another month, which meant we're just up there in Dahlonega, Georgia, picking weeds, painting, just doing nothing while your buddies are getting closer to graduation. Did you
get retrained on knots, or did you do it on your own?
No, they did. The two benefits to that were you can sleep a lot. Those first few days they kind of left us alone. We probably slept. I didn't know you're physically capable of sleeping this much, but I'm not kidding. We'd wake up, eat, sleep from 9 to 12, sleep from 1 to 6, eat, and then sleep all night. It's probably 18 hours a day of sleep for those first few days, which shows just how deprived we must have been. And then, you could eat as well. So when you do pick up with the next class, I think you are at an advantage because,
for sure.
They come in exhausted from the first phase, you're kind of fat and rested. That doesn't last forever, but it gives you kind of a short-term advantage. Plus, you've kind of already learned a little bit about the terrain of the place that you happen to be, so you can kind of help out in that regard. And you do, I worked on knots a lot, and I still barely passed even after a month of doing nothing but knots, but I did ultimately pass.
Yeah, there's one thing that's very good that I think they do in SEAL training, which is, Hell Week is kind of I think it's the 4th or 5th week. I think it was the 5th week when I went through. I think it might be the 4th week now. But if you get rolled during Hell Week, if you make it to Thursday, I think you're good and they'll roll you forward. But if you don't make it if you get rolled on Wednesday, you don't just go back to the beginning of Hell Week. You go back to the beginning of the first day of first phase. And the reason for that is because, like, I think they just want a certain level of physical durability to be tested as a human. And if you were totally fresh going into Hell Week, it would be a massive advantage, because when you get to Hell Week, you are already just kind of beat down. And so that's one of the good things that they do. If you have to go all the way back to the beginning, because if you didn't have to do that and you could game it, you'd get to Hell Week, get rolled, sleep a bunch, be totally ready, refit, get all healed up, because everyone goes in with, scars, like cuts all over your body, and those things all get gnarly infected and everything else. Get all those cleaned up, put on a little bit extra body weight. One of the big, I don't know which one is, it's like it depends on what type of suffering you may or may not like, or what you can deal with, because I was well suited for SEAL training because I don't need a lot of sleep, and I really like to eat food. And you get to eat a lot of food. Like, even during Hell Week, you're eating probably 2 good meals a day, and then 2 meals that are, like a MRE out in the mud or whatever. But they're not trying to starve you. Whereas in Ranger School, it's like, oh, you're going to starve. People lose 20, 30 pounds in Ranger School.
And that's not uncommon for the guys that go straight through, but they do, just to be clear, there is what they call a day one recycle, which is, I think, what you're describing. And so it just depends on the reason why, what you failed, essentially. So if, like, something like knots, you'll just go back to the beginning of that phase. If it's kind of a worse infraction, or you fail something more important, like, so if you're just really bad at, like, leading patrols, like just abysmally bad, sometimes they're just like, this guy, he needs to go back to day one and start again, because he just needs that. First of all, he just needs to be retrained, because he's not anywhere near where he's supposed to be at this point. Or if you're found, guilty of some kind of like an honor violation, not something severe, but like, in the article, maybe we'll talk about later, there was a kid who had, I think the rule was at the time, you're not allowed to eat or keep the, I think you could eat them, but you couldn't keep the snacks that come in the MRE for, like, to eat later. You had to eat it on the spot. You couldn't put it in your pocket for, like, later that day. And he got caught with a bag of Skittles, that he had just kept for later on. They did like a inspection, they found it, and I think he was given a day one, which is, that's like almost a fate worse than death, because every day you have to redo is a horrible day. So you want to redo as few as possible.
And that's like a little bit of a minor infraction. There's guys going through SEAL training where they'll get integrity violation, which pretty much you're getting dropped. So if you, like, straight up cheat on something, like, you're done. Which is real interesting, because on the one side you got this sort of mantra in basic SEAL training, which is, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Which means, like, if you can sneak into the room and get your feet up in the air and sleep for 5 minutes, do it. But the other end of the spectrum is like, if you do an actual integrity violation, they are 100% going to drop you. And it's like,
I've always been confused by that as well. Like, there's a tension there that never totally made sense to me. And we see that at Ranger School, where that was most evident was on night land navigation. And for whatever reason, as bad as I was at knots, I was, like, really good at land navigation, which was strange, because I was this suburban kid. I had never even, I don't think, been camping, but you put a map in my hand, and the way it works is that, there'll be like 5 grid coordinates, and you have an assigned amount of time to go find them. They could be 2-3 kilometers apart, with a swamp, or a small mountain, or any number of sort of terrain obstacles in between you and the destination, and you have a map, and you got to find it, and you get there, and there's a little clicker that you have a little scorecard, and you click to prove that you found the point. And some of them can be almost impossible to find, because especially in the summer, when there's so much vegetation, whatever the little thing you're looking for could be, you could almost step right on it before you actually see it from a distance, because it's covered with stuff. And then there's night land navigation, which is like that, but harder. It's at night. And to get to the honor point, I think, you could use a red lens flashlight, because you have to do something to see the map. But a red lens doesn't help you if you point it forward to try to see something. But some of these markers were almost impossible without, actually turning on a white lens, which I think most people probably did, quickly to at least say like, okay, I think I'm close, but I don't see it, and I'm probably within 10 feet of it. But there's always stories of Ranger instructors who would, be sitting at the point, and they see the white thing coming at them, and they're like, Ranger, come here, and like you said, that's an honor violation. I think that would probably just be not a day one, but like back to the beginning of that phase. But that's one of those ones where it's like, it's that middle ground. It's like, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. Kind of everyone's doing it, but if you get caught doing it, you're in trouble. I don't know. I don't pretend to have the right answer to how that works.
We'll dive back into Ranger School a little bit when we get to the article that you wrote about it, where you actually went back to Ranger School in a sense. But for now, so you get done with Ranger School finally, and it's off to your first duty station, and that's over in Germany.
Correct. Yeah.
And so now, what's your job? What's your assignment when you get in your first duty station?
It was infantry platoon leader, and it was a tough time for that job because I inherited an infantry platoon who had just when I arrived, they were on block leave from a 15-month deployment to Baghdad.
So this is 2003.
This would have been 04 because I was doing all that training, for the better part of the first year or so.
So 2004, you show up in Germany.
Yeah, probably summer 2004.
Is Colonel McFarland in charge yet?
No, it was his predecessor.
Okay.
And so that was a tough assignment because I was the only one in that platoon that did not have a combat infantry badge, and in the Army, that's a big deal. It shows you've served in combat, and they all had for, a pretty long year. And, here's this guy, in their eyes, like right out of college, who's now the platoon leader.
And you get straight put, is this in the 136?
Correct. Yeah.
So you get put right into that battalion out of the gate, the 136 Armored Infantry Regiment, the Spartans.
The 136 Infantry, part of the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division. Luckily, during my platoon leader time, my first platoon sergeant, who's the senior enlisted person that works alongside you, was unbelievable. Just in reality, they probably didn't need me. That's how good he was. But he was also good enough to know that, in real life, you do need a competent lieutenant. So he didn't just do everything. He kind of, mentored me, if that's the right word, in, what you will need to do as a leader, but also was there to kind of catch me if I was screwing up before someone else saw it, and so I really benefited from the experience of working alongside him.
And then are you guys they finished their block leave, they just got back from deployment, they finished their block leave, and now are you starting a training cycle again?
Correct. Yeah. And that's why it was kind of unfortunate timing for me, because my whole platoon leader time was sort of pre-deployment training, but by the time we deployed, my time was as platoon leader was up. So it was I don't want to say peacetime, but it was it was in Germany. It wasn't in Iraq, and that was just a result of when I arrived at the unit, when the platoon needed someone. And so that kind of sucked.
That's terrible.
Yeah, and it's just because they can't, they can't have someone be a platoon leader for 3 years or whatever.
A long time. So how long was the training cycle that you were there for?
It was probably a year between that deployment, or when they got back from that deployment, to when we deployed to Iraq.
And so you only get 1 year in that leadership position?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can there's a few specialty platoons that you can compete for like a second year. I can't remember what they all are. Like there's
some kind of like scout platoon.
Yeah,
or something
like a
that.
scout one, but there's few and far of those between.
And so that's the other thing that's terrible about that, is now you have a new platoon commander come in and take over before they go on into combat.
Exactly. So it doesn't make a ton of sense. It doesn't always work that way. I mean, there's guys where it works better. If let's say you show up 6 months before the deployment, it probably works perfect. You get to do your pre-deployment training and then lead those guys for at least a portion of that ensuing year.
So as you're going on deployment, so what's your job as you guys are getting ready to go on deployment?
Well, it was to lead this platoon, through all the we did a lot of pre-deployment stuff. And in Germany, you go to Hohenfels, which is, about 3 hours from where we were stationed outside Frankfurt. And there's, month or 2 month long sort of training cycles. It's usually divided between gunnery and and sort of operational tactical, training. And it's important. I mean, it's even if you're not the guy who's ultimately going to be with those soldiers, you're still training them.
Right.
And so I'd like to think that, even though I wasn't with them downrange, to the extent that I think they were pretty successful, at least some of that had to do with me, as a leader.
Now, but as you guys are getting ready to deploy, now we're getting down to the nitty gritty, and they say, okay, you're done with your platoon tour. You do a turnover with the guy, with whoever's taking your place. And now where do you get assigned?
So that brings us to where I meet Colonel McFarland. They decided that, we need this, what they call public affairs officer, which typically would be an Army major, in 04. But for some reason, the word had trickled up to him that we have this, Princeton guy, in the brigade. Next thing I know, I'm meeting with the XO, kind of making me an offer I couldn't refuse, And for your listeners, PAO is kind of like a public affairs officer, someone that has to show media people around the battlefield. And so I kind of got roped into that reluctantly. And when they encouraged me to do that, I said, listen, you're not in much of a position to negotiate as a lieutenant or a captain, but to the best extent I could, I said, listen, I'll do this, but, please just get me back to my infantry battalion, sooner rather than later, because I definitely didn't leave a job on Wall Street to be a public affairs officer, and I'm not disparaging. It is an important job, but it's not what I joined up to do.
I mean, in some perspectives, it's one of the most important jobs, because this is the way the world is going to see what you're doing as a Army unit. And if you don't have a person that can convey the correct message, then that can be terrible for a command.
And there were elements of it that were cool in that, what Colonel McFarland, told me is like, listen, you're going to be, with me. Wherever I go, you go. And so, to an extent, that's kind of a neat opportunity in that, rather than just being assigned, let's say one really quiet neighborhood, and you don't really get to see anything beyond that. I'm riding on a Black Hawk all across the brigade AO from, all the way almost to Mosul to Sinjar, where the Yazidis would live. Every day was different. Every day exposed me to like a different part of the battlefield. So it wasn't all bad. But I did want to get back to 136.
So that's that's the position that you're in when you actually go on deployment, and you guys kick off the deployment up in Talifar.
Correct. We got there right after, I'm sure this name's familiar to you and your listeners, but it was at the time Colonel H.R. McMaster would become General H.R. McMaster, and then I think National Security Advisor McMaster. And they had done a really good job in what had been a pretty violent place, but by the time we took over, it was pretty stable. I mean, there were still some pockets of resistance here and there, but for the most part, there wasn't a lot of kinetic stuff going on. And I think, General McFarland, spoke to this a little bit, but I think, he was the beneficiary of, kind of seeing what worked from McMaster. And this was before some of this stuff had become kind of accepted doctrine. I think McMaster kind of implemented some of this counterinsurgency stuff before it became embraced by like the whole Army. But Colonel McFarland saw it because they did a pretty good, right seat, left seat transition.
Yeah, it's interesting that the manual, the FM3 TAC 24 counterinsurgency manual, which when I got to Ramadi in April of 2006, and that there was a draft version of that out on the internet, and that was what I read, where I was like, okay, this is what I need to get on board with. And so it hadn't even been finalized yet in April of 2006. So the fact that McMaster had already implemented a lot of those strategies up in Talifar, and they'd been very successful, was very fortunate that when General McFarland or Colonel McFarland at the time showed up and was like, oh, look around and go, oh, okay, we see what you did and how effective it was, which is a pretty awesome thing. And it's also proving the kind of or exemplifying the type of leader that General McFarland was, because many people, anything, if I show up here, Will, and I look at what you did, I'm immediately looking at what you did wrong, and I would have done different. I would do better. That's what an attitude that a lot of people have, instead of going, oh, wow, you did a great job. Exactly. I will carry on with what you did. That's unfortunately the way it works sometimes with people's egos. But, General McFarland clearly is a guy that's wanting to just do the right thing, and his ego doesn't play literally any role at all in making decisions. So you guys get up there, you see this. And so in those first few months, you actually are the PAO. And you're flying around, like you said. You're going everywhere. With are you interacting with a lot of press up there?
We had embedded reporters. I can't remember where they're all from, but the Army, they were pushing people that way because this was at the time this was kind of a success story. So there was no shortage of interest in what was going on. That was when I first met Travis Patriquin.
Okay.
Who I think we can talk about in a little while, but he was the brigade civil military operations officer, and so we worked very closely in that we both had these kind of like ill-defined, amorphous jobs working with Colonel McFarland, but also kind of just able to do our own thing, and we became real good friends, and we're going out pretty much every day.
Was Travis an SF guy?
He was prior enlisted, and he was an SF like comms guy.
Yeah.
So I think he supported. He was I can't remember the technical name, but he had fought in I think Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan, supporting SF teams with their comms.
Mm-hmm. So, and I made a comment about him being fluent in Arabic. General McFarland tightened me up real quick on that. It was like, no, he had like passing Arabic.
He thought he was better at it probably than he was.
Yeah, and the thing is, he really did have an awesome open mind to understand the culture, and it had a huge impact. And he ended up making this slideshow that circulated throughout Iraq at the time about it was like stick figures and how to overcome an insurgency and what the Sunnis thought of us, what the Shias thought of us, how we couldn't tell them apart, but they could tell each other apart very easily, and how we needed to get engaged with them.
Yep. I mean, it was called How to Win in Anbar by Captain Trav. I remember. you can Google it. And that was so classic because you think about it, we pay, millions of dollars to consulting firms to, put together 100-page, PowerPoint presentations on whatever, and this, here you have Travis just kind of sketching this on the back of an envelope, and it ends up, kind of being, the key to whatever success we had. And that's just a tribute to his, I think unconventional thinking, and his just genuine desire to do what it takes to win, and he had no use for, bureaucracies, for the chain of command, which I think rubbed probably a lot of people the wrong way. Who's this 03 that, is going straight to the brigade commander with whatever crazy, scheme he had. But it just so happened that he was right. And I think it's a tribute to Colonel McFarland to recognize that this young captain is onto something, because a lot of times he'd probably say, you talk to this major, the major will talk to this lieutenant colonel, and then eventually, it'll get up to me. But he kind of embraced like a flatter organization, which you don't always see in the big army.
Yeah, before we hit record, you were asking how well I knew Travis, and I was kind of pointing out that, interestingly enough, at the brigade meetings, which was a bunch of 05s, battalion commanders, but Travis and I were kind of like had a seat at the table. So I had the seat at the table because I was in charge of the SEALs and interacting with all those different battalions. But then Travis was there too, so he had like an 03 and an 04 that would sit there, and Colonel McFarland would listen to what we had to say and take input, and he did have a very flat organization that he was listening to whoever had the best idea in the room, and so just to be in there in all those meetings, and that's how I got to know Travis, just because we're the junior guys in the room. We're gonna kind of have our own little sidebar conversations about what, and we could help support each other. He was definitely much more understanding of how to interact with these tribes, but we were out there all the time. So for us to be able to take some of that knowledge and try and utilize it the best possible way was, just everyone had to work together, so he was another guy that I had the opportunity to work with. And
he was he was a complicated guy in that he, I think, appreciated the importance that these tribes are going to have to our ultimate success there. But he wasn't like, a pacifist. I mean, I think he had a bumper sticker on his little office that said, like world peace, like one well-placed sniper bullet at a time, and he was instrumental in getting us to embrace this squad designated marksman thing, where, the brigade, wanted to have, one guy in each infantry squad that had, received kind of better, marksmanship training. So he knew that killing bad guys is part of this mission, just the same way that trying to co-opt tribes is.
Yeah, and if you went out and talked to the tribes, you'd see that the tribes actually wanted the bad guys to get killed. Yeah. Those tribes had been murdered. I mean, the tribal leaders had been murdered, and massacred just before we showed up, and it took place while we were there as well. So those tribal leaders, they wanted help from the big American and coalition forces, and Travis is the guy that figured out, oh yeah, they definitely want our help, and here's how we could best help them.
And yep, no, you're absolutely right. And then, just on a personal level, I think there was something about him that, again, this is a testament to Colonel McFarland. He wasn't your typical infantry officer. He's a little overweight. He smoked a lot. He was a hard worker in that he would do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission, but he was kind of lazy in that he's not going to do a lot of just BS staff work to impress his boss. And I think there were people within the infantry world who, didn't respect that as much. They preferred kind of your standard issue, super clean cut, fit, infantry guy that kind of looks like he, comes out of central casting.
Yeah, yeah.
And Travis wasn't that. And so I think it says a lot about Colonel McFarland that he kind of saw this, this guy, this eccentric guy, and he recognized that there's a spark there that is important, and that can help get us somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a bit of a wise ass. And he also, I don't think his hair or his mustache were in regs at all.
No. He's not going to ace the PT test. He doesn't really look the part. His boots probably aren't, polished back in garrison, but there's no one you'd rather have, over there to actually, do what needs to be done.
No doubt about it. So your mission, so Talifar has been pacified to the point where it's like you have a full brigade up there of 5,000 or 6,000 people, and it's like, actually, we don't need you there anymore. You can leave a battalion up there. We need you to go handle what's going on in Ramadi. That was kind of the next shift that took place in your all's deployment.
Correct. Yep. I remember there were rumors kind of starting to float, among the brigade staff that, something may be going on kind of behind the scenes. And I don't know how much, I certainly wasn't privy to those discussions. Maybe Colonel McFarland was, but yeah, as fate would have it, I think maybe 4 or so months into that, the brigade got sent down to Ramadi. That's when he finally, let me get back to my infantry battalion, which was actually in a town pronounced Hit, H-I-T, which is along the Euphrates River, a few hours from Ramadi. Very similar to Ramadi, I think, demographically and sort of culturally, and just kind of like a mini version, a smaller city, but a smaller unit assigned to deal with it. I went on block leave. We get like a week of leave, during the deployment, and that's when, when we moved. So I left, Talifar, went on my leave, and when I got back, I arrived in Ramadi and then convoyed out to Hit for my new job. And
he actually sent up a request to get you replaced as PAO, and the Marine Corps sent him a Marine Corps major named Megan McClung, who ended up taking your role.
Correct. I never met her because, this happened. She probably stepped into my role while I was on leave, and I got there and I got onto my next assignment. But no, that's exactly what happened.
So you get out to Heat, and what's your job out there now?
Now I'm basically the Travis in Heat. I'm their what they called civil affairs officer, which was a great job. There was a Marine Corps, I think there was a Marine Corps Civil Affairs Detachment, and then there was the Special Forces ODA. And so all three of us basically had the same mission, which was to, try to do whatever we could to, tampen down the insurgency, whether that was through, civil affairs projects, reconstruction work, trying to develop governance, and most importantly, the tribal engagement. So I was in touch with Travis, kind of trying to, as best I could, learn what he was doing with some success in Ramadi and apply that to what we were doing in Heat. So that, yeah, it was a great job. I worked directly with the battalion commander and the sergeant major, who was a former Delta guy. I don't know how he ended up, with a mech infantry unit, but just an amazing guy. I have stories of what he did that we can get into later. But a challenging environment. It was. They didn't much like us there. Probably similar to Ramadi. There was a pretty active insurgency, and those who weren't actively supporting it were just intimidated by it. A lot of fighting. By the end of the year, I think we had close to 200 wounded out of 650, 700 person battalion, which is a lot. And yeah.
So what what did your mission actually consist of? So would you go out with the conventional forces? Would you go out and do interaction with the tribes? Like, how did it go down?
So we did a little bit of all those things. So one day I might go out with the Marine Corps Civil Affairs team to, go to the hospital, which was just in complete disrepair. You go into like their emergency room, and I mean, it's just filthy. I mean, they didn't have any of the stuff they needed to perform, basic procedures. Tried as best we could. Well, first of all, we have to do some vetting to make sure that we're not, actively supporting like a operating room who's operating on insurgents that we just got done fighting. Trying to get the community, on its feet as best we could. The theory being that would in turn, make it less fertile ground to recruit people to fight us. I don't know if that was ultimately proven correct or not. We worked a lot with the Army ODA. It was a really good special forces team. It was led by an Army major that I actually am still in touch with today. They had deployed there before, so they had some pre-existing connections to some of the influential tribes that were invaluable. So we spent, hours just, smoking cigarettes and drinking chai with, it was the Algood tribe. And the end point that we were working for there was to get their tribal leader to commit his young tribesmen to join a police force. And we literally built it, one police station at a time, strategically located in different parts of the city.
So were those similar to the combat outposts that we were putting in Ramadi?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what we call them. It was like Cops 1, 3, and 4. Each had one of our platoons in them, and then we would try to, get an Iraqi police station manned by these tribesmen somewhere nearby, and that was absolutely critical to success, because before we developed those relationships with that tribe, we could have a recruiting drive and like 2 guys show up, but all of a sudden, if the tribal leader gives it his blessing, you got like 150 guys that also happen to know that area better than any of us. Yeah.
They can tell who's from here, who's not from here. They can tell where this car come from. It's like if someone shows up in your neighborhood right now with some brand new car, you go, oh, the Smith's got a new car. It's the same thing for those tribal leaders and then the tribesmen that live in those neighborhoods. It's like, oh yeah, this person's not from here. They're from another country. They're from Jordan or Saudi or wherever, and they're here to cause problems. So let's get rid of them.
Yep. And it didn't happen overnight. I mean, there were, and this is something that Travis and Colonel McFarland probably spoke to, but this is the result of hours of relationship building, and these SF guys were very adept at recognizing that you don't interact the same with them as you would in a Western business negotiation. You don't show up with and expect to get this thing tied down in an hour. This is months of just sitting together, eating, smoking, and really developing a trust and a rapport that will pay dividends, but it's probably not going to pay dividends overnight.
Yeah, no, that is like a classic SF mission. And did those guys have language? I imagine they did.
They did. It wasn't great, but I think more important than the language was just the cultural understanding of what was necessary, and it's something that you just wouldn't really find in a lot of conventional Army units, outside of someone like Travis, who just kind of had an innate appreciation for it.
Yeah, and that's something that when they say that SEALs and Green Berets are roughly equivalent, and there's certainly some equivalent skill sets, but they're better at that stuff than we are. That's just the way it is. They have the language. They actually train for it. When you look at their whole training pipeline is built around doing that. We don't have anything like that. We would insert stuff like that. Like we would do tribal engagement field training exercises. And when I was in charge of the tribal engagement field training exercises, they would just devolve into a big, massive ambush, right? It'd be like, oh, you got set up and now you're getting killed. So, which is probably just bad on my part, but that's what we were doing. But the Army, the way that they develop those SF guys to build those relationships and all that that's like the perfect SF mission. That's the perfect SF mission. And luckily we had Travis and Travis, then it was Colonel Dean and all the various battalion commanders. they built these great relationships with their counterparts, and my guys did too. You know, the SEALs that worked with, not with the tribe. We didn't. I don't think we were. We worked with the tribes on a very small scale, but we interoperated with the Iraqi forces, the Iraqi police and the Iraqi forces. That we did, and I think we did a decent job of that, of building those relationships and making them trust us and realize that we were going to stay there. I think SEAL's not great at that, but I think the guys did a decent job at doing that in Ramadi. But we would not have been able to take the lead on that without a guy like Travis, and then the rest of him and Colonel McFarland kind of explaining what we were doing to the rest of the battalions on the ground. That's kind of the way it looked from my perspective, because SEALs are not great at that kind of thing. Like, now, we were really good at sniper overwatches and getting those positions secured when they were building those combat outposts. Like, that's a great job for SEALs. Going for chai, not the best thing. What was your op tempo like?
I mean, it was pretty intense. Partly by design, partly just by virtue of the place we were. The battalion commander, myself, the sergeant major, we'd be out every day. The platoons manning these combat outposts were, living this all the time. And it was one of those things where, I mean, this from Ramadi. I mean, it could be the most innocuous mission in the world that could turn into a pretty intense day, just because, the enemy doesn't really care if you're there to go build a school or if you're there to go kill a bad guy. You're still a target. I'll never forget, this just kind of shows maybe I was, naive or whatever early in the deployment, but I asked my brother to send over, to raise money in his high school, to send over like soccer balls and soccer jerseys, kind of the stereotypical, hearts and minds, the kids will love it. And Travis and I had actually done a similar thing in Talifar, and it worked out great, and everyone was happy. And so we tried this in Heat, and we went to, I think the town was Cabeza, which was a nearby village, maybe 20, 30 minutes away. And, we visited the school, we handed out the jerseys, the balls, the kids were happy, the teachers were happy, we were all excited that we had developed this goodwill in the community. And on the drive back to Heat, we get hit with an IED. It was like a 4 Humvee convoy, I think. Luckily, it went off like kind of between vehicles. Mm-hmm. It might have damaged one, but no one got hurt. But it was just one of those moments where you're like, what the hell are we doing here again? Mm-hmm. I have my brother, raising money at his school to send this stuff over. We do this great mission, and they're trying to kill us, So, that's kind of how a typical day might unfold. You might go out to do something like that, and the next thing you know, you're getting, shot at. The story I was going to mention from the Delta Sergeant Major that was pretty remarkable, in that it resulted in, I think, a Distinguished Service Cross, a few Silver Star. A lot of awards were given because of the heroism. But it's another example of something that began. It was just a routine, I think, battalion meeting downtown between the battalion commander and his company commanders, and I think they chose to meet at one of those combat outposts that day. I can't remember the exact sequence, but.
So just both U.S. Army, like battalion commanders going to meet with one of the company commanders in town,
with all his with the number of company commanders. Yeah, I think it was like a battalion leadership meeting.
Got it.
And trying to think of exactly how it unfolded. They were in a convoy, and one of the Humvees took a turn a little too wide and ended up sort of tipping partly over into a culvert, on the side of the road. And as, another Humvee pulled back to, tow it out, an automatic weapon opened up on him from like the third story of a building, probably less than 100 meters away. And, in like one burst, I think it hit, a company first sergeant, so the senior enlisted in the company, a company commander, a lieutenant, and maybe someone else. So in one instant, you have a good portion of this battalion's leadership, wounded. And in this instance, there was a young West Point graduate who was, I think, a field artillery officer who, had been hit himself, but despite that, ran back, into the fire to pull. I think it was the first sergeant, who was a big guy, into Wade Bradley, to get medevaced, and then this Delta Sergeant Major noticed that an enlisted soldier had been hit, and it hit, I think it was his femoral artery, and was, he's basically bleeding out. Yeah. I think the medic, was just kind of overwhelmed by the situation. He tried his best, but it was just kind of too much for him to deal with. And the Delta Sergeant Major, I wasn't on this mission. I was back at the battalion headquarters, but I could hear it, going on the radio. I could hear the transmissions, and then I talked to all these people afterwards, and he literally reached in and pinched the artery with his hand, and I don't know if he had just received some kind of advanced life-saving training as part of Delta, or if he just had that presence of mind to kind of just figure it out. They called for a ground medevac, I think via Bradley to the nearest combat outpost that had a helicopter place they could get picked up safely. So they literally carry him while this guy's wrist is in this guy's leg, holding the femoral artery shut, trying to keep it cinched shut. They transfer him from the Bradley to the helicopter. He still is holding it. And they fly to Al Assad, which, I don't know what that would have been, maybe like a 10-minute flight, or, I don't remember how long it took. And he literally holds this guy's leg until they can, get him into the combat support hospital at Al Assad and hand him over to the surgeon. And the guy survives and pretty much makes, I think, a complete recovery. But had it not been for this Sergeant Major, that guy would have been dead probably within minutes. Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff. I mean, that wasn't routine. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a dramatic example, but stuff like that, was going on almost every day.
Yeah, this is something I think I talked about with General McFarland, was the fact that you were mentioning like being on the radio and how you can hear what's happening, and it was so interesting because in Ramadi you'd be hearing. You'd hear what was happening, and so when the Marines were getting hit, when the Army was getting hit, you could hear these reports coming in, and like even when my guys would kill a guy or my guys would take out an RPG guy, like you'd hear it and everyone would hear it. And I'd be down at one of the combat outposts and like Army dudes would give me like a head nod because like the SEALs just because I think it was NSWTU RAM, which was or our call sign Red Bull. It's like Red Bull just killed whatever one enemy carrying an RPG, and guys would be like fired up. And also the negative of that was like when someone got hurt or someone got wounded, someone got killed, like you'd kind of just you'd eventually hear it. Maybe you didn't hear it on your net, but the platoon command or the platoon commander or the platoon sergeant would hear it on the battalion net and then tell the guys what happened. So it's a very, very shared information that everyone's kind of knows what's happening, which was a very unifying thing. When you go to the chow hall or something, like everyone's in this fight together, and you'd know what had happened an hour ago. You know what happened on the battlefield an hour ago. We'd know when there was mass casualties, like guys would go up and donate blood. It was just everyone was in the fight together, and that I really never thought too much about the fact that we were all listening to radio traffic and then passing the word on, because you wanted people to know there's a big explosion. People are going. Like the boys are saying, like, "Hey, what was that?" Yep. And then 4 minutes later, you go, "Hey, the Marines just hit an IED up on,
Yeah, you'd be laying in your bunk and you hear something blow up, and you're like, "Well, something just happened." Yep. And then there's that moment where you're sort of nervously expecting, or like, I just hope the next report isn't that there's whatever wounded, And sometimes it would be a relief that no one had been. Other times you hear that someone had been, and that was not great.
How did you hear that Travis was killed?
I honestly don't remember exactly. It was probably on one of those sort of secure chats on your computer. I remember where I was, in our little sort of makeshift little plywood office, and I think the first word maybe was not specific. It's just like a bunch of officers or brigade staff, from Ramadi were hit, and I don't know if his name was associated with it at that point, but shortly thereafter, I think it became clear who it was, and people knew that I had been close with him. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty devastating. I mean, we had at that point we had already lost people. I'm trying to remember the order of the different people that I knew that were killed. I think, if my memory is correct, I have it actually tattooed on my arm. I think Travis was December 6th. I had another friend that was a day before my birthday, July 24th, who's also on my arm. So I'd already lost him. But then when the Travis one happened, there was something about that was even more devastating. And I think it's it's kind of human nature when someone is lost, you kind of romanticize that person, and they can take on a larger than life persona that maybe in some cases is a little exaggerated, and there's nothing, that's just human nature. But I'm not embellishing when I say that with him there really was something uniquely amazing about him. Not that every loss isn't horrible, but this one really stung, I think, for me, and I'm sure for a lot of other people.
And the other horrible thing about this for you is, so you had been, as I mentioned earlier, you had been replaced by this major, Marine Corps major, Megan McClung, and she was with Travis, and they were both killed. And so, if you really wanted to peel back the onion, she was sitting in your seat. Mm-hmm. What would have been your seat,
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, that thought's crossed my mind. And then the I don't know if he was the driver then, but Specialist Vincent Pamonti was, I was close to him too. We were kind of like the island of misfit toys in Talifar. It was, Pamonti, there was a Sergeant Hartman, Travis, and I, and that was our little gang that would go out together, either on our own or with Colonel McFarland. And that was my vehicle, that was my seat. The only thing I tell myself when I, because I don't want to feel guilty, is that I kind of raised my hand for what at the time was the more dangerous job, so it wasn't like I was leaving the dangerous one and then someone got killed. I kind of was trying to go in the other direction, and that just, you can't really ever predict what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's just that attack alone, you got people, then this is something that General McFarland was talking about. It's like, these are, the brigade staff, and so you think, oh, well, the companies and the platoons, they're down there fighting, but the enemy doesn't care. The enemy doesn't know where you're working. They don't know what unit you're attached to. It doesn't matter to them.
The other guy whose tattoo, or I was good friends with, who's tattooed on my arm, is Captain Jason West. He was the Brigade S1, personnel, and he got hit with a RPG. I don't know what he was doing out that day. Probably some kind of a staff function of some sort. But the enemy, they see a Humvee that's a target. It doesn't matter who's riding in it.
Did you see the progress taking place in heat? So in Ramadi, for me, I left October 21st, 2006, and the last big combat outpost that I went out to put in, and I was actually literally was with Colonel McFarland in the combat outpost. There was almost no security there yet, and we're standing there, and it was very interesting because there was very limited fighting. Like, my SEALs didn't kill anybody, which was very surprising. And it was like, there was a little bit of fighting, but it wasn't as drastic as it had been in the past. So that was kind of a little bit of a hint that maybe there would be some lessening of the violence. But there was plenty more fighting, and actually after we left, there was kind of a apex of fighting. Mm. But did you guys see up in heat during your deployment? Did you see things? Did you see progress? Did you see things starting to get better?
Unfortunately, I don't think we really did. The violence was almost continuous until the end of the deployment. To include, there was a mortar attack on an Iraqi army formation on our compound that we think, someone had leaked the location to, the bad guys. And, that was a huge mass casualty that killed, I don't know if it was over 10, but a lot of Iraqi army soldiers, dozens wounded. Literally the night before we left, or while some of us were leaving, we had one of the what we call right seat, left seat ride transition meetings with the incoming unit that was going to backfill for us, and we were sitting in the battalion conference room, and we're going through the slides, this is the local sheikh, this is the local mayor, whatever, trying to orient them to the battle space, and as we're sitting there, we had soldiers that were on the flight line that night. It was dark, ready, lined up to leave. They were beginning to rotate out as the new soldiers were coming in. And, in the middle of the meeting, we hear, boom, boom, boom. And we're like, oh, shit. And it was at one of those moments. It was close enough. I mean, we got mortared almost daily. And it's a big enough compound that generally it didn't do any serious damage. It made you nervous every time you went to the porta potty, just because you didn't want to be sitting out there when they went off. I mean, it was common, but this was close, and we knew there were guys outside, and there was that moment, and then we started hearing the screams and the shouts, and we're like, oh shit, and it turns out they had hit the flight line, as the guys were waiting for the bird inbound. Thank God, so we paused the meeting, run outside, try to collect the wounded. It's dark, so you couldn't really even see where everyone was. I remember running, and I heard like a whistle, kind of come past me, and I was like, that doesn't sound good. So kind of just, kind of grit your teeth and hope nothing goes off, and nothing did. To this day, I don't know if it was just like a dud or, something definitely was coming down, and there was no explosion. So I was like, okay, good. But thank goodness no one was killed. There were, I don't even know if anyone was too seriously wounded. A friend of mine got like a piece of shrapnel through his calf, some like sort of relatively minor, it wasn't minor to him at the time, but relatively minor injuries. But I mean, that shows that was like literally the last day that kind of stuff was still going on. But to your question, it was like a switch went on, like probably within the first month or two of that new unit being there, because I don't think they had almost any casualties all year. And I kept in touch with my interpreter, who was an amazing guy, after I left, and he said, you're not going to believe it, but you could literally take off your body armor and eat a kebab, out like the hospital we were talking about before, outside the hospital, and no one will mess with you. Whereas when we went there, we'd have to shoot smoke and like run, because if you just even walk inside, you're going to get shot. And it was almost instant. Like it was, but the instant was after we left. But I think it was as a result of a lot of the work that we did.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to watch that, to watch Anbar settle down, and same thing, we got reports from the guys that replaced us, and it was just amazing to watch that transition take place. Now, as you're getting ready to go home, are you thinking about getting out at this time?
Yes. So let's see, that would take me towards the end of my 3-year or 4-year commitment, and it was, I think, a 36-month commitment overseas. So that would have been my next kind of decision point. And my decision, even from when I joined, was more than likely leaning towards going to do my time and then get out. But I was open-minded. If I fell in love with it, I would have continued. I think ultimately the two reasons why I did decide to get out. One was just the op tempo at the time was so intense, and I refer to it in that article that you began the show with. And I mean, it sounds kind of dramatic now, 15 years later, but it's, if you put yourself back at the time that was written, these units, it was a year on, maybe a year off, if you're lucky, and then a year back on again, and there was no end in sight. We didn't know when this was going to end. It looked like this could be going on for 10 years. And with if you get into Afghanistan, it kind of did, in a different location. And I thought to myself, I was single at the time, at some point I'd like to have a family. How can I even meet someone, much less, if I do meet someone, say, oh, by the way, I'm going to be gone for, 50% of the time. And then when you're not gone, you're training, so friends of mine who got to 136 a year before I did, they got there, did 15 months in Baghdad, an extended deployment, came back for less than a year before a 14-month extended deployment in HIT. So they're looking at 29 months out of, let's say the 36 months they thought they were going to be in Germany deployed, and then probably half of the home time you're in the field, separated from your family. So I thought to myself, is that really a good deal for, you know, a future wife, you know, to say that, you know, 32 out of 38 months I'm going to be gone.
Don't tell my wife it wasn't a good deal.
And so I mean, nothing but respect for the people who did that with. I cannot even, as now the father of a 7-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, I don't know what the hell I would do if I had to say goodbye to them for a year. You know, not even knowing if I was even going to come back, and if I did come back, it was going to be a year. I mean, I have a tough time going away for a week saying goodbye. You know, and so I think about, like, when I was in the Army, I was a single guy. The only thing I was missing was the bars in Germany. You know, like, you know, we'd spend all our time like, when we get home, we're going to go to this place and that place. How those young fathers and mothers dealt with it is something I can't even wrap my mind around.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting for me. I had my family and was going on deployments, and my buddy Leif, you know, once he started having kids, because he didn't have kids till he was out of the Navy and all that, but he was like, yeah, when his kids were, you know, 6-7 years old, he's like, dude, I don't know how you went on deployment, like just saying goodbye to your kids. And the Navy goes on 6-month deployments. It ends up being about 7 that you're gone, and we're pretty consistent. There's guys that have done longer. Occasionally, that some of them get messed up in the rotation thing, and they'll reset everything, and some team will get a year-long deployment. It'll happen literally maybe once every 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, but you can pretty consistently know that you're going to be back in 6-7 months. But yeah, you're right. You know, you think about what you miss for a little kid,
especially at those young ages.
Yeah,
where every year there's these milestones. You know, it might be, you know, 14 to 15. You know, that sucks too. But it's like 2 to 3. You know, 3 to 4.
I left on my first deployment, and my son couldn't crawl. I mean, my first deployment to Iraq, my son couldn't crawl when I left, and when I got back, he was walking around. Wow. So I missed like crawling. I missed push up, crawl, walk, and then my second deployment to Iraq, he was like when I came home, he was swimming which really kind of hurt me because, you know, I'm a frogman, you know, and some other dude at the Navy base taught my son, you know, some lifeguard taught my son how to swim. That was not cool. So I can see how that weighed into your decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. No, that was part of it. And then the other part is just, you know, on the officer level, you know, you're doing staff jobs for like 1 out of, you know, 3-4 years of leadership jobs, you know, and I looked at that world and I thought to myself, you know, do I really want to be slaving over PowerPoints, you know, for 3 years for, you know, to compete for the opportunity to lead guys for maybe one if I'm lucky. You know, so those were kind of the two things that led me to decide to, you know, get back into the civilian world.
So what was the first move in the civilian world? Back to Vail for a ski bum tour?
Yeah, right. Vail never looked so good, right? Yeah. I think, you know, having been to Iraq, one of the things I really wanted to do was to put myself in a position where maybe I could have some influence on these kinds of decisions in the future, you know, the decisions that got us there. And I was realistic enough to know that as a, you know, 30-year-old or whatever, you know, I'm not going to be making those decisions, but maybe even on the margins, you know, if I put myself in the right position, I can have some influence. So I wanted to get kind of into that, you know, policy world. And I knew that maybe the best way to do it would be through graduate school. You know, finally I was actually trying to come up with a plan for the future, something I had never really done before. And I thought, you know, if I want to end up, you know, in the policy world, maybe at the Pentagon in a decision-making role, the way to do that would be to go to a place where I ended up going called Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which would then, you know, often feed people into some of these government positions.
How are you paying the bills at this point?
Well, I had, you know, a good amount of money saved up, you know, I was a single guy, 14 months in Iraq, you know, with no expenses. Now we did blow through probably way more of that than we should have, you know, carousing around Europe when we got home from Iraq. Thinking back, you know, we were pretty, you know, we had, again, like kind of like you hear about, you know, the young 18-year-old privates, but we weren't that much more mature as officers, you know, just jumping on planes and, you know, going to, you know, one weekend we'd be on the Mediterranean. Then that's the most amazing thing about being in Frankfurt is you're a 2-hour budget flight from pretty much anywhere. But anyway, I did manage to save some. And then I got the GI bill to pay for, I think it was half, and now I think it might even be better. I think they might pay the whole thing, which was nice because I had no government. I didn't the Army didn't pay for my undergraduate education. I was still paying loans out on that. So it was nice to at least get something in exchange for this service. So yeah, the GI Bill helped, and I went to Johns Hopkins.
And didn't you take a job for a while as like a news assistant or something like that? What was that all about?
That was while I waited, while I was going through sort of the graduate school application process. And I think at this point I was already getting a little bit of an itch to write, but I didn't maybe even really fully recognize that yet.
Even though you were an English major, you never had the itch to write prior to this?
Not professionally. I mean, English was more about just the fact I loved reading these books, and kind of the cost of getting to read them was you'd have to write about them sometimes. But yeah, I don't remember. You know what it was, actually? I do remember. There was a former... I think I had read either his books or some of his articles, and you may be familiar with his name. He was a former Marine infantry officer who became a correspondent with the New York Times. His name's Chris Chivers, C.J. Chivers. He wrote a book called The Fighters about Afghanistan that's incredible, and it had spent a lot of time embedded, on the front lines. The Fighters, part of it takes place in the Korengal Valley, where there was a lot of intense fight in Afghanistan. But I think I just emailed him out of the blue, and I introduced myself. He had gone to, I think, an Ivy League school. I think he had gone to Cornell maybe. And I said, hey, there's some parallels in our career paths. I'm also this Ivy League guy, served overseas, and I'd like to maybe get involved in writing, but I don't really have any professional experience. And he was amazing. I think he was like the Moscow bureau chief at the time. Gets an email from just this random guy, and like he's like, hey, call me tomorrow. And I got on the phone with him, and he said, yeah, we do have this program that's kind of like a glorified apprenticeship for people that are interested in writing, and you're going to make a lot of coffee and copies, and but we'll also give you the opportunity to get some of your own stuff published, under the mentorship of some of the best journalists around. And so I did it, through his introduction, and it was incredible. It really was incredible.
Did you go somewhere for that?
That was just in the Washington bureau, and I loved it. And it did seem in a lot of ways like it would be a dream job. The problem was that for someone like me, without really any other, it's not like I'd been the editor of my college paper. I didn't have any experience other than, what I got when I arrived. They said, the best we can probably do is kind of send you to a small paper somewhere, that the New York Times owns, kind of almost like a farm team, like a single A, newspaper. And if you do a great job there, in Biloxi, Mississippi, writing about high school sports, we'll bring you back, in a few years to work, in the big leagues. And at that point, I was already, 31, 32 years old. This was now my fourth career, if you count, the working at a ski bar, then, finance, then Army. Am I really ready to go back to the Ranger school of reporting? With no guarantee, and the newspaper industry was already kind of dying. So, and I even saw it in the Washington bureau. I saw every few months some office was empty, where there used to be a really prominent reporter. And I'm like, man, that's a big risk to go somewhere and run the risk that 3 years from now they're like, oh, by the way, we're cutting more staff. There's nowhere for you to go. And so graduate school just seemed to make more sense. If it had been 23, it probably would have been something I would have done, but not at in my early 30s. And did you get the bug though at all? I got some ideas in my mind. Yeah, it definitely gave me the bug. Seeing what those reporters were doing, and just how interesting that work seemed, and seeing them on the phone all day and working their sources, and then you open the paper the next day and you see the result of that. With millions of people reading it. I mean, that was kind of intoxicating to see, even though I didn't have an opportunity to do it.
I wonder if that buzz has gone down at all now, because you work all your sources and do your big story, and then you print it, and there's some knucklehead did a tweet about it 36 hours ago, and it's already moved on, and the news stories move so fast these days. All right, so Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. What did you take away from that?
I mean, they try to give you a foundation on international relations, just very broadly speaking, and kind of trying to establish a framework to decision making when it comes to these things. And I don't think there's a cookie cutter. It's not like you go to the school and then you just are magically endowed with the ability to make wonderful policy decisions. But there was a course we did on ancient political theory. So Thucydides, Machiavelli. And I think there's some value in bringing that kind of knowledge to contemporary problems as a way just to frame it, if not provide you with the actual solution.
And are you learning sort of the inner workings of the system? Like, are you starting to see, oh, this is the way the government works. Here's the positions that are open. Here's what I could do. Here's where I could have influence. Are they kind of introducing that to you as well, or is that just from being in DC? Do you sort of learn that by osmosis?
Both of those, but no, the networking element is real. I mean, most of the professors we had, had been in government, or even in some cases were in government. There was like a CIA. Guy who taught us, I think his course was like anthropology for strategists, which was just fascinating. Because he was like a PhD anthropologist for the CIA. I think his focus was on Afghan, social networks, but, trying to, so that's one example of a government person. There were other prominent, either prior or current government people that were teaching us, and so just exposing us to the kinds of jobs that might be out there was important. That's how I ultimately learned about that presidential management fellowship program that you mentioned that I ended up doing. And
that's what you applied for and you got in?
Yeah, and that's a way that they try to get talented, qualified people into government service, and you would apply to the fellowship. If you get accepted, then you apply to a particular department that you want to go to, whether it's the State Department, the Defense Department, all the way down to like the Forest Service or the Department of Agriculture. I mean, was really one of the only feeder mechanisms of young people into government. And so I applied for
Is it hard to get into?
It was pretty competitive. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't impossible, but the application process at the time was pretty rigorous, and particularly for like the more desirable places. So DOD, for us, it was the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That was a competitive one. State Department was pretty competitive. I ended up doing an OSD.
What was your first job in there?
One of the best parts of this fellowship was you could basically do whatever you wanted because you were paid by the fellowship. And so when you show up to like the assistant secretary of whatever, you're like, hey, and I'm free labor, and most of us, we're reasonably well qualified. So who's going to say no, to this guy that will probably do a good job and costs your office nothing. And so you could kind of write your ticket. You would just go around the Pentagon and you'd talk to prior fellows and say, hey, did you work for so-and-so? How was it? Did you get a lot of responsibility? And there's like this little sort of internal, mafia. And a lot of the more senior ranking people in the Pentagon had begun as these fellows, and would usually look out for them and try to pull them into the more desirable, positions. And so my first one, I think it was on what they called, and you could do some elsewhere too. So this was, I think, on the Joint Staff. It was called the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell. It was working for Admiral Mullen at the time. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It was made probably around 2010-11 on Afghanistan policy. I think it was corresponded shortly after like the Obama surge to Afghanistan. That was my first assignment.
And how was it seeing it from the other side? Because so it's interesting. When I was the admiral's aide, but then when I came back from Ramadi, I was going sometimes to go and briefed Admiral Mullen on what had happened in Ramadi. I was kind of like the guy from the battlefield, so I would do that. But I spent a lot of time in the Pentagon, not a lot of time in the Pentagon compared to a lot of people. I spent I went to the Pentagon quite often when I was the admiral's aide, and I got to understand I got a glimpse at that world, right? And then going back there after going to Ramadi and seeing the way the war was being understood back there and what the attitude was like and what the atmospherics was like, it was very disturbing in some ways, and also is very interesting in other ways. What was your take on it?
I mean, it was complicated because it's all those things that you said. I think it was partly humbling in that you realize that, I had maybe sort of these grandiose visions of, helping make these important decisions, and you realize that
you're thinking you make decisions, you end up making PowerPoints.
Yeah, exactly. Your decision is, is this going to be, double spaced or single spaced, and you realize that, there's oftentimes a very small number of people who are actually making the decision, and that your ability to influence that is pretty limited. The other thing I recognized over time, and I don't want to sound too negative, because I really did, even just being a spectator to those decisions as they're being made was pretty amazing. I wasn't in the White House, but I'd get the readout from the meeting in the White House that, Secretary Clinton said this and Panetta said that, or Gates maybe at the time, I can't remember. So, I mean, that was pretty fascinating, even if you didn't have really much of an ability to influence it one way or the other. And you're right, it could also be disenchanting depending on what the decision was and whether or not you happen to think it made sense. Professionally, the other thing I recognize, though, is that a lot of the more senior positions were political. And I don't think I had a full appreciation for that when I joined this fellowship. I kind of thought it was more like the military, but maybe even better because it would be like accelerated and that there was like a defined path. And I realized once I got there that the path kind of stopped at, GS 15, like 06, let's say, 05, 06. And beyond that, 80% of the jobs are political appointees. I wasn't a very political person. I didn't have any political connections. I wasn't really interested in political, I wasn't spending all my time in DC, trying to rub shoulders with the up and coming, political leaders. And so I thought to myself,
you're a terrible bureaucrat.
Yeah. So I thought to myself, how am I going to ever get to where I need to be to make decisions if I'm not political? And that's kind of those are the connections you need to get there. I mean, every once in a while there would be someone that would just work their way through the civil service system and get a position like a deputy assistant secretary position, but most of them were political. And so after about 4 years, even though I really did enjoy my experience there, and I got to do some cool stuff. I spent some time with the SEALs doing counterterrorism work in Africa. I worked. The leaders I worked with were fantastic. Nothing bad to say about them. But I'm like, there's kind of like a glass ceiling. I don't want to be doing the same job 20 years from now, and I don't know how I can get past it.
So then, what was it? So you see. You have failed to plan effectively for how your future is going to work out. And at some point you look around and you see, okay, maybe it's time to try and figure out to write. Is that the next step you're going to take?
Yep. And so, trying to think of the exact chronology, but yeah, I'd say about 4 years into my time at the Pentagon, I thought back to these interviews I had heard back when I was doing my report and in graduate school, working as assisting a journalist on one of his projects, and they were recordings that the Army Center for Military History had done with and they do these with everyone, from General Petraeus down to Private Jones, who was involved in a historic episode of one kind or another. There's thousands of them probably. And these were some ones that were done with the soldiers who had been assigned to guard Saddam Hussein in the months before his execution. And I remember hearing them at the time as, in a different job, and I didn't do anything with it, but I just remember thinking, this is amazing. If someone needs to tell this story. And so fast forward like 5 years, I'm thinking about what to do next, and I think, that story still hasn't been told. There might be some potential there. And so I reach out to a woman who I had been friends with for years, all the way back to college, who worked in publishing. She worked for Penguin, I believe. And I just sent her like a one-page email explaining, that what I thought was a pretty amazing story about these soldiers, and asking her, do you think this has legs? Do you think any publishing company would be interested in this as a book? She said, absolutely. I know these agents. Let me put you in touch. You can work on a proposal. Just to back up, what the story really was, or what struck me about these interviews as being particularly remarkable, I guess, were a few things. One was that these were just like 18-year-old MPs. These weren't like, CIA, highly trained, interrogators. They played a role too, but the guys whose interviews I listened to, they were like, in some cases, they were right out of basic training, and then they're sitting as close as we are right now to Saddam, 12 hours a day, drinking tea, smoking cigars, telling stories. He could speak English when he wanted, strategically. He'd pretend he couldn't if he didn't want to. And so like the intimacy of their connection to him was, I thought, pretty shocking, as was the fact that that their backgrounds were what they were. And then what also became clear to me was the peculiar nature of these relationships that had developed, in that they found themselves over time kind of starting to like the guy. And they knew, they weren't idiots. And I want to make that clear, because I think some people, that don't read the book might think, oh, these are just impressionable young Americans, they don't know any better. They knew he was guilty of these things. They weren't under any illusion that he wasn't a bad guy. But they hadn't seen that. They had only seen this charming older man telling stories, acting like he was genuinely like interested in their lives, asking about their girlfriends, their families, telling them, hey, if I ever get out of this, I got a lot of money, I'll put you through college, and like, just crazy stories. One of the medics went to explain to Saddam one day that he was going to be gone for a week because his brother, I think, had either been killed or died of an overdose. He had come from a pretty rough neighborhood, pretty violent background, and it says something about their relationship that he felt the need to like explain to Saddam why he wasn't going to be there because he knew Saddam would miss him, which was true. And Saddam got up and hugged him and said, like, I'm so sorry, like, that you lost your brother, but I will always be your brother. And so there were just like story after story like this, and it wasn't. If it was like one guy, mm-hmm. I'd be like, well, whatever. That's strange that this one guy was susceptible to this. But they called themselves the Super 12, and out of 12, probably like 8 of them had the same experience. As did some more highly trained people like FBI interrogators and guys that definitely came into this with a more worldly background. So anyway, I thought this is crazy, and this is a story that needs to be written, and that's what ultimately became that book.
Yeah, the book, The Prisoner in His Palace. I'm gonna read a little excerpt from it. So they're in court. Saddam's in court. Enough, sit him down, the judge ordered from his perch in the front of the courtroom. Saddam then shouted, This is the behavior of traitors. God is great. God is great. Using one of the catchphrases that had been featured so prominently in many of his presidential speeches, he added, and curses upon the evildoers. Not finished. He delighted some in the audience by hurling the base Arabic insult, curse the father of your mustache. Of course, the persona of raging showman that commanded the world's attention in the courtroom disappeared the moment the elevator doors shut and Saddam was returned to his cell on the floor below. Chris Tasker, who's one of the guards, was sitting outside Saddam's rec area beneath the courtroom one day, observing Saddam alone in what was little more than a steel cage with 4 chairs when Saddam suddenly looked at him. The former president was seated on a metal chair with his legs crossed, puffing a cigar. Tasker, not entirely sure how to react to the prisoner's stare, felt the need to say something to break the uncomfortable silence. And he decided to go with the innocuous, that sure smells good, sir. You want some? Saddam asked gamely, gesturing for Tasker to join him in the cell. Sure, Tasker replied, trying to appear nonchalant. Tasker slid the cell door open and entered the room. He took the cigar from Saddam's outstretched hand and inhaled the sweet tobacco smoke, careful not to cough in front of Saddam, before exhaling and sending it arcing into the cool air of the underground cell. Soon, though, the mounting silence that accompanied the shared cigar again grew awkward. Tasker searched for something else to say. How did you get started with cigars? He came up with, a natural question for the Cohiba-loving Saddam. Fidel, Saddam responded, smiling. Saddam liked to share the story with the guards of how Fidel Castro had taught him how to smoke cigars. Sometimes he'd even show pictures of the two of them together, likely taking during one of his rare foreign trips, a 1979 visit to Havana. Tasker thought this was pretty cool. What would his buddies back in Ohio think when they heard that he'd smoked a cigar with Saddam Hussein? So this is a crazy book.
It is. It's nuts. And there's so many elements to it. But one of the challenging, I think, parts for these soldiers was the fact that it's not your typical sort of Hollywood ending. So if you think about the Bin Laden mission, you go there, you kill the worst guy, you come home and you can sit at the bar and people give you a pat on the back. In this instance, these guys came home, and if you put yourself in their shoes, what are they going to tell the guy sitting at the bar next to them? Oh, we were there for Saddam. We kind of got to like him a little bit. We were kind of haunted a little bit by having delivered him to his execution. People in America are going to just shake their heads. They're not really going to know what to make of it. It's not consistent with everything that they had been led to believe about Saddam, which again was all true. But these guys' experiences was also true. And the morning that they brought him in the Rhino armored vehicle to get hanged, he walked from the back of it to the front of it, and he like embraced them one by one with they had some tears in their eyes in some instances. Apparently he did too. And he thanked them, each one individually. These are the people who are bringing him to get killed, like in an hour. Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Thank you. You treated me so well. I'm so grateful." And one of the questions it, of course, raises is, to what extent was this just a big manipulation from, a sociopath who was good at convincing people to get what he wants, and in this case, maybe that was his cigars, whatever kind of better treatment he might get, whatever the case may be. Or was there kind of like a genuine, human connection that developed?
It's not really clear which of those it is
in
the book.
Exactly.
Yeah, sort of like, and another cool thing about the book is you go back in history and you've got these other interviews that take place with people that were tortured by him, had family members killed by him, his other family members. And so it's not like you wrote what do they call it? What kind of piece is it when someone what kind of piece is it when someone does a really nice, not a hit piece? What's the opposite of a hit piece?
Fluff.
A fluff piece. Yeah, it's not like you wrote a Saddam fluff piece. Mm-hmm. I mean, you lay out all this horrible, horrific things that he did, not just as a leader of a country, but like as an individual human. Mm-hmm. So this isn't a puff piece. It's really a powerful display of how horrible this guy was, but then this weird like human side where he's hugging the guards and playing chess with them. It's weird.
And I think that's exactly right. And if someone, I do book events and people would always ask, well, was it a manipulation or was it real? And some people would already assume it was, it was one or the other. And I would say, honestly, like if you force me to answer, and I don't think we will ever know, it's a mystery, but it's probably a little of each. I think it probably began, as an effort to manipulate. But I think over time, it did evolve into something real. And I think it shows maybe something about, what makes these guys' experiences, I think, unique from even other soldiers was, it's one thing to shoot at like an anonymous target, from 200 meters away. And not that that's necessarily easy on anyone either, but it's, someone you've never seen before, you're never going to see him again. Someone who may have just been trying to do something to you. In this case, this is someone they got to know. First of all, this is someone that had never done anything to them. It's not like Saddam had just been shooting at them, and they saw him as a human. They saw him praying, they saw him bathing, they saw him, writing in his journal. They talked to him, and taking the life of someone that you've actually gotten to know as a person is in some cases just going to be harder, even if that person was a really bad person. So yeah, I think I try to get into that in the book, and it's been optioned into a movie now. Hopefully that will happen. They've signed this director, Johan Renck, who did Chernobyl from HBO, which I think won an Emmy. Yeah, it's a great, they have an Irish actor, Barry, I think Keoghan's how you pronounce it, and now they're working on getting the right budget, funding for the budget they want. And so I think about how Hollywood works. It's never real until it's they begin filming, but hopefully we'll get there.
Hey, and I'll tell you what, even when they begin filming, it's freaking crazy. It is one of the craziest things that you could imagine, getting something all the way through that process. You don't know what's going to happen. Like during a movie, like one of the characters could get hurt, someone could get sick. They could run out of money, and they just like, oh, you know what? We're just abandoning this project. Like, it's a crazy thing that to have happen. And yeah, so where you're at right now is like a critical moment. Hopefully people are listening to this, because it could be a really fascinating look at these characters, both Saddam, but then also how it impacted these individuals that are working through it. Mm-hmm. Could be definitely. Are you? How much have you seen the screenplay?
I mean, that's the thing, is once you option it, you kind of do forfeit most actual creative control, and it's kind of just on them at that point how much they will or will not involve you. In this case, I have to give them a lot of credit. They were very, solicitous of my opinions. Having calls with the director. I was in constant contact with the screenwriter. It had been optioned by a group before this, so I'd already kind of been down this road and knew how it works. But in this case, they did seem very eager for my input, which I appreciated because they didn't have to do that. And so I have some degree of faith that what will come of it will be hopefully generally consistent with what I had hoped. I mean, I don't want to go too much down the road of the last option, but in that case, I think the creative vision was really different from the book, and it almost to the point where I'm like, do I even want this to happen? Financially it would be nice, but do I really want to watch a movie that doesn't even resemble what I wrote about? So in this case, I'm much more comfortable, I think, with where things have ended up.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting, and it was really cool. I just made a movie, as I guess and I was on set like almost every day, and just sitting right there with the director, with the actors, like talking through everything with the screenwriter. Like it was, I was very lucky because I was, afraid of that too. Of course you're afraid of it because, my name's on it. And so if they take something with your name on it and they just do whatever they want with it, that's a very scary proposition. So to have people and that's one of the reasons, the first person that approached me about this deal was a guy that I could tell, this guy, Ben Everard, I could tell that he had the same deep feeling like, oh, I get the core meaning of this book and the core theme of this book, and we will keep that theme. And I was like, okay, well, that's because other people that offered me to option the kids' books were all like, we just want it, we'll take it, we'll give you money for it, but then it'll be ours. And I was like, scary.
And my biggest concern really was the soldiers, because they had entrusted me with their story, at zero benefit to them. They really didn't get anything out of this. And I figured I owe it to them to do justice to their story. And what really worried me the most was, handing this over to someone in Hollywood who will then twist it in a way that will not be true to them and potentially make them look, undeservedly bad, and I say undeservedly because I want to tell the truth, so if there's truthful stuff that looks bad, fine, but don't twist the truth into something that makes them look like just like some dolt or some naive, rube who just didn't, there's a lot of directions they could have brought it that I think, would have been, both incorrect and a disservice to the guys who I think risked a lot to allow me to tell their story.
When you did the original book deal, did you get in advance? Did somebody actually pay you money for this thing? That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I worked for, one of the, Scribner, which was one of the top publishing houses. The editor I had there was one of the top, editors in America. I'm by far the least, distinguished guy he's worked with. He's worked with best-selling authors, prior to me.
The fact that you rolled in as an unpublished author, and you hadn't even written any newspaper articles at this point.
I didn't have a lot to
I guess you did some Wall Street Journal or some New York Times stuff, some articles.
Yeah, I had a little bit, but it was pretty flimsy when you look at the caliber of the guys he would typically work with. And I will say one funny, it's funny now, it wasn't funny at the time, little anecdote on that is, I remember I worked my ass off on these first, let's say 3 chapters, 50 pages or something. And I thought this was the greatest thing I had ever written, and I sent it into him. And I'll never forget, I could pull it up on my computer right now. I kept it, his response, and it began, Dear Will. And I think this is verbatim. He said, what do you say? I don't know how else to say this, but I had a viscerally negative reaction to these pages, period. In short, you violated every rule of storytelling. And then he went on for like 6 pages to outline all the things that, I had done in his estimation wrong. And I thought to myself, I just quit this job, which was a good job and a steady paycheck, to, go out on a limb and write this book, and I have no aptitude for it, and here I have, this premier editor telling me that it was just a disaster. And it took like a few days to kind of bounce back from that. But once I kind of collected myself, I realized, first of all, that I think he was right. It wasn't like I read it and I'm like, no, this is BS. I did wonderfully. he made amazing points. And what he was really getting at was, you're not a bad writer. This isn't the right kind of writing. You're still writing like it's some combination of like a policy grad school paper, or or like it's kind of, you're not making an argument. Like that's not the job you're supposed to be doing here. You're supposed to be telling a story. So for example, this is like a simplified example. I wasn't this bad, but like, I would say something like, Saddam killed, these 5 people. This shows just what a bad guy Saddam is. I was editorializing. I was trying to like connect every dot, and not trusting the reader to connect some dots. It's the old show don't tell. If you describe what Saddam did, the reader's smart enough to conclude he's a bad guy. You don't need to, bang him over the head with it the way you would in an opinion column. And so he just got me to write in a way that I was telling a story. He would always say to write filmically, bring the reader into allow them to imagine what it was like, in that room with Saddam. What did it smell like? What were they wearing? What were those details that make it seem like a movie, which I think worked because ultimately it did get adopted to be a movie. So I think to that extent, I succeeded. But I'm very grateful to him now for that feedback, even though at the time it was pretty devastating.
6 pages of devastation.
Yeah.
I like it. It's my kind of editor right there. In the meantime, while you're writing this book, you get married.
Yep.
And you somehow convinced your wife to marry basically an unemployed author at this point.
Yeah, she got a real raw deal because when she met me, and I was this high flying secretary, office of the Secretary of Defense, employee with a steady paycheck and a good job, and all of a sudden, now you're living one book advance to the next. So yeah, she I don't know if she got everything she bargained for.
And you end up leaving and you move out to Colorado.
We moved to Colorado.
This time not to be a ski bum, but to be some kind of maybe a little bit of a ski bum.
Yeah. We were, we had been living in Arlington. That's where she was working for a property management firm. I was working at the Pentagon when we first met. During that time period, I left that job to do this book full time. And I think both of us, I'd grown up in D.C. She had been living there for a while. We had no kids at the time, and we thought to ourselves, I could write the book from anywhere. She could do her job actually from out there. They had properties out there, and we're like, why are we in D.C.? It's expensive. There's a lot of other fun places to be. So we just kind of drew up a list of potential landing spots, and Denver won out, and so we headed out there.
Up and out to Denver, Colorado. Now you start doing some. Oh, you have a kid, by the way.
Yep,
right?
She was actually, so the whole idea of us going out there is, footloose and fancy free. She got pregnant, as we were moving. So yeah, my son, Bates was on the way as we made the move.
And you start doing some articles, writing some articles, and one of the articles you wrote is called "Steal the Thunder," and it's from Outside Magazine, and it's from this. Would you call it a sport? Would you call it a sport?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Indian relay racing on horses, which is freaking nuts. These guys, you ever heard of this before, Echo Charles?
No.
Okay, so these dudes are racing a horse around a track, no stirrups, no saddle, and you have to change horses 3 times. Is it 3 times?
3 times.
3 times, and it's like a pit crew is waiting with your next horse. And so you do a lap around the track, and then you come flying in to this area where all the racers have their horse with their people staged, and you jump off your horse. Someone catches, what's that guy called? The catcher?
The catcher.
The catcher grabs the horse that you just jumped off of. Another dude has the horse that you're going to get on, and you jump onto that horse. They smack that horse, and then that one does a lap, and then you do this 3 times.
Okay.
And it's like chaos. There's people falling off, getting bucked off, horses hitting each other, people hitting each other. It's chaos. And so you cover this. You focused on this one crew of riders called the Brew Crew, and man, it opens up. Obviously, it ends up not just being about this horse relay racing, but about life on the reservation, about poverty, about addiction, about suicide. And then, which is interesting, and you make this note, we look at what some veterans go through. Oh, it's like poverty, addiction, and suicide. and here you have these Indian racers, poverty, addiction, and suicide. A lot of parallels there.
Yeah, it was a remarkable story. I don't think necessarily because of the way I wrote it. It's just the episodes that I cover were just pretty crazy. I had initially, I was living in Denver. I'd finished up the book and I was looking to write more. And I think I had seen the movie Wind River. I don't know if you saw that. Taylor Sheridan, really good movie, and it's about law enforcement. I mean, he's the one that ultimately I think went on to do Yellowstone. And,
he's
more well-known stuff.
Freaking amazing.
Sicario.
That dude is putting out work.
Yeah,
I mean, what a beast.
And this was one of his first ones. Was it Jeremy Renner was the main guy in it? But it's about law enforcement on a reservation in Wyoming. And I knew, I lived in Denver. I'm like, there's these reservations out here, and it's something that most Americans it's a world they don't know anything about, and that we probably would do better to learn a little bit about. And so I headed up to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Not too far from Rapid City, about 90 minutes probably to the southeast, right on the Nebraska border. And it's notorious for being one of the poorest and just tough reservations in America. I mean, none of them are very few of them are in great shape, but this one's even worse. I mean, the life expectancy I think is equivalent to Afghanistan, 50s, and the income, it's just very poor. And very remote and spread out, and brutal winters and hot summers, just a tough place to live, but also a place of remarkable natural beauty. I mean, you're right near the Badlands, and it's kind of majestic in its own way as well. Then I went up there with the intent of doing a really deep, embedded account of law enforcement, tribal law enforcement on this reservation. And as I was doing that, I just talked to a woman whose dad or uncle was the police chief. And she's like, oh, by the way, you should also meet my nephew. He does this really cool sport. And I thought to myself, okay, why not? It sounds interesting. And then as soon as I started talking to this guy, I'm like, wait a second, this is the story. This is an even more interesting story than the law enforcement. Maybe I could connect them, but it's going to be through the lens of this sport. And he also happened to be just a super charismatic, nice, welcoming guy who introduced me to the sport you just described. And it's exactly what you said it is. It's just remarkable horsemanship. They ride these things bareback, around a mile and a quarter track. And I think one of them told me, this is if people watch this and then the Kentucky Derby, no one's going to watch the Kentucky Derby. This is 20 times more exciting. And each of these, what they call exchanges, where you get off one and on the next one, that's actually what typically determines the winner of the race, because you could have the fastest horse in the world, but if it takes you 20 seconds to dismount one and get on the next, the other horse is going to win. So it's a combination of the speed of the horse, your ability to get it around the track, but most importantly, your ability to kind of get on and off, and they're meanwhile they're colliding with each other.
It's mayhem.
It's like the pit crew. They're all in a very condensed area trying to, with a dozen horses jumping all over the place.
Yeah, and they just have white chalk on the ground that designates where you are. So it's not like there's anything that can stop the horses once they start running around. You go and watch these things, there'll be just random empty horses running around the track too. It's mayhem.
Guys are getting stomped, but the deeper part of it though is there's a few, it connects to their history, in the Lakota, are some of the most talented, horse riders, in American history, and before there was an America, they were doing this, and so it's something, and there's a spiritual element to it too, that they have, where there's kind of a deeper connection between man and horse that's almost difficult to describe, and some of the ways that they can break wild horses kind of defies, you can't teach it, it's something that they've somehow passed through the generations, that transcends just, you could train someone like me probably for 100 years to do that. And one of these guys can just do it almost instantly. You'll see them. We went on a ride they do every year, kind of retracing the footsteps of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And, they bring their entire families up there and ride, 20, 30 miles a day, 100 miles total. They'll camp out at night. And, I was very honored to have them, invite me on this. And, you'll watch little, 5-year-old, jump on, this, however many 100-pound horse, and just with no saddle, and just look as effortless and natural, and and then I'll get on one. And I'm like, holy shit! Like, like this thing, if he just takes off, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's not easy. But these kids make it look easy because it's something they're just raised doing. And more importantly, it's something they can do to give them positivity and happiness in circumstances that are really tough, and where the suicide rate is just nuts. Like you said, the addiction rate. There's no one who isn't impacted by it, who doesn't know someone who's addicted or know someone who's killed themselves. But this is kind of this one thing that connects them to something they're proud of. I mean, it's not dissimilar from what you hear about, like boxing, historically in the inner city. It's a way to have discipline, to have pride, and to have, access to adult mentors. I write about a few of the guys in the book who have gone out of their way to, look out for these kids, who in many cases don't have very good home lives. And this is like the one kind of thing that can anchor them a little bit.
So when you write something like this for Outside Magazine, and by the way, anyone go read it. It's Steal the Thunder. It's an Outside Magazine. You can just Google it and it'll come up. But so did you write it and then present it to them, or do you pitch them a story and then they say, yeah, we'll take it? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, it's kind of like the tribal, there's Iraqi tribes and there's the American tribes, but it's not different. It's tribal engagement. It took a long time, I think, to earn their trust. I mean, there's no shortage of white people that have shown up on the reservation making promises that, that ended up just burning them. There's a thing called poverty porn, which has happened there, where reporters will parachute in from New York and go to the worst possible thing on the reservation, and there's no shortage of it, and spend 24 hours saying, look how, effed up this is, take some pictures, and then leave. And then, the people on the reservation are like, okay, well, how do we benefit from this? All you did was just tell the rest of America that everything's screwed up. And yeah, we have our problems, but like, that's not all we are. It's just a collection of problems, And so I think what I tried to convince them of through my words and my example was, listen, main thing is I'm going to be here for a while. I'm not just coming in for a weekend. I think it ended up being close to like, it was a whole summer. So it was at least it was probably closer to like 6 months of, back and forth from Denver. Again, my poor wife now with her, baby kid, with, me driving back and forth to South Dakota for like what amounts to probably less than minimum wage when you I don't remember what
Do you get an advance for
Yeah,
these
you get
stories?
paid, but it's like a contract. It's like, it might have been like, $10,000 for what amounts to 6 months of work to include expenses, so I'm staying at like, cheap, motels up in, whatever that town was in Nebraska, when you divide the number of hours spent producing this report, I mean, it's contributing like nothing to my family. It's contributing to my, I guess, development as a writer, which is great. And I'm very fortunate to be able to tell this amazing story, but it's not paying the bills. But yeah, so I spent time up there, and I just said, hey, I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm not going to gloss over the problems that are here, because part of what made the sport so special is the fact that it's helping people to overcome the problems. If I just ignore or gloss over the problems, then the sport becomes kind of less meaningful. And they still push back a little. They're like, hey, how come, do you really need to say this or that? And I said, yeah, I mean, I can't just ignore it, but I'm also going to shed light on the positivity and the joy that this brings. And I'm just going to try to be balanced. And I think at the end of the day, I know at the end of the day, because I keep in touch with them, that they, respected the final product, and then they thought that it did right by them.
So with that big windfall of 10 grand coming in from Outside Magazine, you decided to do another story with them.
Yeah. So I decided, to keep digging myself into a deeper financial hole. Yeah.
So the next one you do is Army Ranger School is a laboratory of human endurance. And this is another article that you did for Outside Magazine. And you go, as I mentioned earlier, you go basically back to Ranger School, where you're going to do 24 hours on, 24 hours off, and you're going to see what Ranger School looks like from the outside. What been something like 15 years since you had gone through it. How was that experience?
That was also a great assignment. Again, my poor wife, Bates, my son, is probably now like 2 or 3, and here I am saying, oh, by the way, I'm going to be getting on a plane, from Denver to redo Ranger School. Good luck out here in Denver by yourself, 2,000 miles from your family. To earn another, whopping paycheck, like making $3.75 an hour or whatever, because I'm working, redoing Ranger School. Theoretically, I'm working now 20 hours a day, or whatever the case may be. But looking back on it, I don't even know how, how the military is. Like, they don't give access for these things to just everyone. And in fact, no, they had never given access to anyone to do a story like this in the Army, at least. Somehow I slipped through the cracks. And then the Ranger leadership at the time was also like shockingly disengaged, which is great.
They didn't notice what was happening.
Yeah. Like they're always like, do you want to meet the whatever the commander was? And I'm like, no, I'm happy. I met they assigned 2 Ranger instructors to kind of be like my shepherd, the guys I worked with. And then they were just both normal. One was like an E7, one was an E6. They were just normal instructors who got assigned this mission. And they were awesome guys. I'm still in touch with them. And I was more than happy just to deal with them and just kind of stay beneath the radar, because I knew that nothing good would come of too much leadership attention to this journalist just, hanging out there. And so, they allowed me in. Day one, same thing, show up like 2 a.m. or whatever when the new students arrive in the middle of the night at Fort Benning for the first phase of Ranger School. And my intent all along was to just tell the story of the school, through the experiences of a handful of the students. And then weave in maybe a few of my own memories, as opportunities presented themselves. And so the first few weeks, really and I started to kind of panic a little bit because this was a big challenge. I'm like, I can't tell this story through the experience of 200, 300 people, just anonymous, shaved-headed people. Like, I need to bring someone to life, but who am I going to bring to life? Because they all
a bunch are going to quit.
They look, and they might quit, and they all look the same. And so I really had to quickly try to hone in on a handful of them that I'm going to tell the story, through their experience. But who are they going to be, and how do I make that happen? Because they're working 20 hours a day. They don't really have time to sit down with me for more than a few minutes. And so I was really kind of struggling with like identifying who are these people going to be. And I kind of had in the back of my mind, I want to make this story relevant, representative, I guess I should say, of the experience. And so I don't know how Bud's is, but Ranger School typically has like certain demographics. Like there's always going to be younger guys, in Ranger Battalion, who I think, to make ends, to go from E4 to E5, you need to successfully complete Ranger School. So that's like a huge group that's going to be in every class. There's always going to be your infantry officer graduates, a lot of West Point types, who are assigned infantry. That's going to be a big contingent. And then oftentimes there's going to be sort of older special forces guys that for whatever reason, that may not have gone to Ranger School yet, and that this is like an important sort of element of their career progression, or just NCOs in general, like infantry NCOs that didn't have a chance to go earlier in their career. So you have like the young enlisted, older enlisted, and then younger officers are like your typical groups or buckets, I guess. And then now there were women for, one of the first times, that had only begun maybe a year or two prior. And so, I wanted to keep my eye on that, even though there were only a handful of them. And so gradually over the first few weeks, I finally, got to kind of identify, 1 or 2 people from each of those groups who seemed willing to talk. I mean, some of them just didn't want to, which is understandable, who seemed like they had kind of cool stories to share, were outgoing, sort of natural storytellers. Maybe came from a background that was particularly interesting. And so so then I decided, okay, these are the people I'm going to follow, and I'm going to spend most of my time with them on that cycle you described of 24 hours, the same cycle that the instructors usually had, which was like a day on and a day off. And then I was also going to tell the story of the instructors, because that's a whole different part of the equation that I hadn't had any experience with as a student. I never saw behind the curtain. I never knew what was going on when we were training.
Yeah, one of the things that's in the article, no body type has a monopoly on grit. So it's like you can't tell like which one of these people are going to make it and which one aren't going to make it, whether you're tall, short, fat, skinny, like muscular, weak looking, whatever the case may be. It's like you don't really know. As you're watching these things from the outside, what's your like overall assessment of Ranger School in terms of what it teaches you about human nature?
I mean, I think it teaches you a lot. And the grit comment is an important one. And I think this may be one of the areas, I mean, I've never gone to BUD/S, and, you know, I think each branch has its own sort of stereotype of the other ones and whatnot. But I think maybe one of the differences, though, is that, you know, Ranger School, I don't think it really does put a premium on just being an absolute physical, you know, stud capable of just lifting a lot of amounts or doing a lot of, you know, 8 million pull-ups or whatever the case may be. I mean, all that's going to certainly help. It's not going to hurt. But I think more important is grit's a great word for it. It's just a toughness and an ability to kind of think back to just like what grunts, just the word grunt is another good word for that. You know, historically, looking back at World War II, you know, just the ability to endure,
just to
suck and to endure hardship. There's nothing really sexy about it, but not everyone can do it, you know, and the people that can do it aren't always the ones you would think. You know, it might be some runty little guy that isn't that strong, but he's just, nothing will break him, you know, whereas you might have another guy that you put him in a gym, he could bench 8 million pounds, but, you know, how's he going to do when he hasn't eaten in a week or hasn't slept in a week and has to make decisions, you know? And so it teaches you, I think, a lot about yourself. You know, taught me a lot about myself. You know, having gone into that, you know, I had generally been pretty successful at everything I had tried to do, you know, athletically, academically. And, you know, I got in there and there were a lot of moments where I'm just like, you know, am I not cut out for this? You know, or I'd look around and I'd just see someone that was just doing better than I was, you know, and I'm just like, man, this guy, like, how's he doing so good? You know, like I want to.
It's got to be weird when like an 18-year-old kid is kicking your ass.
Yeah, and you just look at him and you're like, this guy, nothing can break this guy, and then you know deep down that I am almost broken, you know, and this guy seems unfazed. Now maybe he is, he's just not showing it. You don't know, but it really it shows you yourself in a way that very few things can do, in a way that can be, I think, pretty humbling. Yeah.
Would you, as you're watching, could you start to see people that were going to break? Like we have an expression, I don't know, it's a big deal, but we would say like guys would get quitter's eyes. Like you'd look in their eyes and you could see that they were rationalizing the various reasons why they're not going to be there much longer. And sure enough, like, and you could never predict that prior to, you know, Hell Week or some tough evolution. And I only went through Hell Week. I've only seen it like one other time from the outside perspective, and I didn't really even see that much of it. But just watching guys go through it, it's very difficult to tell. Like, oh, I'd bet my next month's paycheck on this guy. That's not a good move. Almost no one will do that. Almost no one will say, yeah, I'll put money on this guy over here. Almost no one will do that, because even in your own class, you're looking around like, oh, this guy, he's a D1 water polo player. This guy's a D1 wrestler. This guy, and you go, this guy's got it. You know, no, they're quitting. And by the way, D1 wrestlers and D1 water polo players also make it. So it's like it's just impossible to predict. Same thing at Ranger School.
I think so. I mean, I think you could probably have, you know, you could pick maybe 5 guys and be accurate on a handful of them. You know, but you can never be 100% sure on a particular person. Absolutely. And yeah, you see that. I did see that, and it was painful to watch, you know, because they're trying hard, you know, and I'd been in those shoes. I mean, it's like you said earlier about, you know, healing up, you know, prior to Hell Week, how that would have made such an advantage or given you an advantage, because just the things that would appear to be not difficult become incredibly difficult when you, like, for example, my feet, for some reason, my feet are still screwed up, but I was very susceptible to like trench foot and blisters. No matter, you know, what kind of preparation I would do, they'd say, you know, wear these kinds of boots or do this or that, you know, to help. Nothing helped. And, you know, so for me, every step at one point, I don't remember what phase it was, but it was a period where it got really bad. I mean, literally every time your foot hit the ground was like, it felt like needles coming into your foot. And so imagine spending 20 hours a day hiking up and down mountains when like just walking down the street was like agonizing, you know? So all of a sudden, you know, simple things become very difficult when you're in that kind of pain. And so I would see guys, you know, in similar situations, you know, as an observer, and I'm just like, man, that guy, it's not looking good, either because of like the physical stuff he was dealing with. And you start to see just the resignation on their face. And it's just like it's almost like you see the Grim Reaper just kind of hovering above, ready to take them out. Or, sometimes you see people that just don't seem capable of making, good decisions, in stressful situations, and you give them multiple opportunities in Ranger School. You have a leadership position in each phase that you need to pass. And so like you might be the platoon leader. And so there's a day where you need to do an ambush. Let's say, there's guys who play the role of the enemy, the Op 4, they'll come walking down the road. You got to do an ambush successfully, in the eyes of the instructor. And typically if you fail one leadership position, you'll get at least one or two other opportunities. But you see some guys that just can't do it. They get 2 or 3 chances, and each time it's just a disaster. I mean, there was one where I swear to God, I felt bad because I was kind of laughing, because it was like, I think the instructor said to me, he's like, where the hell's the platoon leader? He's like, this operation's been going on for, this firefight's been going on for like 10 minutes, and I don't know who's in charge. That's not a good sign. When eventually he kind of like came out from behind like a tree. It was almost like that scene in Band of Brothers where I think what's his name was like hiding behind the hedge.
Oh yeah.
And I can't remember his name. He's the guy on Friends,
Captain
right?
Sobel.
Yeah. And I'm like, I started laughing. I'm like, oh, fuck, like there he is. Like he just like, where's he been for the last 10 minutes? And so you see things like that, and you're just like, oh boy, that's not going to end well for this guy.
There's a lot of talk about the standards of these various courses and maintaining the standards. Is there anything that you noticed that was have the standards maintained? Have they gotten easier, gotten worse? What do you think? Yeah,
that's a tough question. I'd say a few things. I guess first with the instructors, and now I'm sure they, at least the instructors they put me with, were probably among the better ones if they were smart. They're not going to like just assign 2. Are you allowed? What's your policy on language here?
Say whatever you want.
Yeah, like they're not going to give you like 2 shit bags, that to be your like the guy showing you around if they have any sense. So those 2 guys were amazing, but I saw pretty much all the instructors in the course of 9 weeks, and I was uniformly impressed, even compared to the ones I had. And I think one of the reasons for that is that I was going through this in like 03, 04. When it was probably like half and half. Half the instructors had never deployed to combat. And so there was kind of this holdover of the guys that I think were just, at least a few of them were just kind of like sadistic and just liked just the power trip they'd be on, up in their own little kingdom of Dahlonega where no one could tell them what to do. And they didn't really have real world experience that they were drawing on. I was actually in there when Pat Tillman got killed. I remember there were a bunch of guys in my recycle group actually up in the mountains waiting for that next class, and I got to know them. And they were telling me they were from Tillman's company out at Fort Lewis, second Ranger Battalion, and so they were telling me all about what it was like to serve with him. And so they were pretty hit hard when they found out he had been killed. And like one of the instructors, he said something like basically insulting, about Tillman, like, oh, I heard Tillman. I don't remember what he said, but it was very tasteless, and it was basically because he hadn't deployed. These young guys they had been in Afghanistan in one of the early fights, and there was like this tribal friction, like these young. He was like, who are these 18-year-olds that act like they're such badasses because they were in Afghanistan? I'm the instructor. They're not giving me my proper respect. And as a result, he said something, and there's almost like a fight.
I was going to say, like, that seems like a fight.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what's going on, and so you're like, this is not that professional. This isn't what should be happening. On either side. When I went through, not all the instructors. Like this was like a pretty small number, and it even got to the point I think where there was the son of a prominent officer, maybe a general, who was going through the course and was hazed pretty badly, because they knew who he was and who his father was. And the father like basically got up on a helicopter the next day and just like cleaned house. And it was not a situation where, the kid was imagining stories, because I had friends that were in that class, and they told me that the kid actually, what had happened is they had gone back to Benin, and, the father kind of just innocently asked, how was it? And his son, I don't think, said a word. He just sucked it up, took the abuse, and graduated. Some of his friends, I think, said, oh, by the way, sir, you should know, they made him do X, Y, and Z. And so they're the ones that brought it up. He wasn't complaining at all. And it was unprofessional, and they got rid of some of these guys. So there was a little bit of that going on back when I went through. I didn't see any of that, when I wrote this story 15 years later. And I think one of the reasons for that was that all of these guys had been in combat, multiple times. And so they understood this isn't just a game. There's going to be real world consequences. We're doing this to make these people more effective as combat leaders, not just to give them a hard time.
Well, from my experience, combat is very humbling, and it can if you haven't been to combat and you think maybe you're a little bit insecure about the fact that you haven't been in a combat, and what better way to make up for your insecurities than by acting like a real jerk to these young trainees that are going through. I can see where that can get out of hand.
Just the last part to that, as far as is it more difficult or not, I think the main things that make it tough are still there, which is just the lack of sleep and the lack of food. That seemed indistinguishable from when I was there. It didn't seem like any changes had been made. The one thing that had changed that I think you could argue made it, I don't want to say easier, because it's certainly not easy, and it didn't impact, I don't think, the essence of the course, but there was less of what we would call smoking. I don't know what you call it in the Navy, but smoking would be like when the ranger instructor or the drill sergeant just, drop and give me 100 push-ups, 100 flutter kicks, 100 push. Like when we went through, that was like constant.
Just constant.
And so you were functioning at a constant state of like muscle failure, which then made everything else harder because you're already exhausted. There was less of that smoking that I witnessed. Again, the sleep and the food were the same, and the demands of just being out, in the rain and the cold, and the overland movements, all of that was the same. I think the lack of smoking, you could make the argument that probably made it a little bit easier, but not dramatically so.
Yeah, it's weird because like in the first phase of SEAL training, which is like, it used to be 9 weeks. Now I think it's 7 weeks. But the 4-mile timed run you have to do is 32 minutes. 8-minute mile seems like no factor, right? That's pretty lame, really. But what you don't realize is that, the night before they woke you up or you didn't get to bed at midnight. You were out on the beach getting wet and sandy, and you were doing, literally 1,000 8-count bodybuilders. And then you get done with that at 2:00 in the morning. You go back, you shower, you go to bed, and then at 4:00 in the morning, you're lined up on the beach for a 4-mile timed run. By the way, there's a high tide which pushes you into the soft sand. You got boots and your utility pants on, and the I would say that the 4-mile length is not measured by anyone. And so sometimes you'd run a 4.1 mile, 4.5 mile, 4.3 mile, depending on the time. So, for me, it was like everything I had to go as fast as I possibly could to pass those runs. And same things with like 50-meter underwater swim. That's actually not that hard for most. Well, it's not that hard if you're training for it. What happens is, though, you're same thing. You've been in and out of the water for 2-3 weeks for 2 or 3 weeks in and out of the water, inhaling or breathing all this crap, and just about everyone is like coughing up half a lung. So now all of a sudden you're doing a 50-meter underwater swim on, with a bunch of phlegm in your throat, and so all that stuff that stacks up, the compounding, like you're talking about movement at night or movement like during a forced road march. Dude, if you do a 10-mile forced road march or a 15-mile forced road march, and then you start doing evolutions, depending on how conditioned your feet are, you may be like in a real deficit before you even start because of that right there.
Absolutely. I mean, if you took your average like member of a CrossFit gym, and I've done CrossFit, for the better part of the last 15 years, less so in the last year or two, but it's something I've always enjoyed. And, I would often think to myself, I could look around, most of the guys in this room would dominate these Ranger School physical standards if they showed up just fresh, rested, with good shoes and, a good night's sleep, and without the stress of, knowing what failure might result in. But when you add those other elements, it becomes a lot. 49 push-ups, who can't do 49 push-ups? But when you're doing it on no sleep and you know that failure means you're done and that your whole career is kind of riding on this, and when you have an instructor the instructors are notorious for like, sort of inconsistent standards, like what is a push-up? How far down do you got to go?
Yeah.
If they start no repping you, do you panic? You're at 10 and all this, let's say you've done 20 and they've only counted 10. Now you're like, oh my God, I'm starting to get tired. Am I really going to, do I have 29 more? The mental and the physical things, that the challenges become compounded by some of those stresses for sure.
Yeah. And it's 9 weeks right now? Was it 9 weeks when you went through?
Yep.
Has it been that? I thought it was longer than that.
No, they're back before I went through, there was a desert phase. I don't know when they got rid of that, okay. But that's before my time. That was a while ago. Yeah,
it's very interesting. I mean, there's like let's say you were trying to fill up a bucket full of suck. And, in Ranger school, it's like, you can fill a lot of that bucket with no food. You can fill a lot of that bucket with no sleep. But you're only filling it for 9 weeks. In SEAL training, it's like, well, you're going to get food and you're going to get sleep on the weekends, which is kind of nice, but there are also going to be times where you're not going to sleep at all. But eventually, if you're going through some kind of training like that, they're going to fill up that bucket with suck somehow or another.
And they add the other part. I don't know if you guys have this either, but there's the peer evaluations.
Yeah.
And that's a part that is tough too, in that it's like Survivor. At the end of each phase, you vote, 1 through 10. Who's number 1? Who's number 10? And that can be humbling. And it can be, that's not a foolproof system either, because you get, 4 guys from the same Ranger company, for example, in the same squad, they can find ways to game that too. So, and sometimes it's funny to see how that all unfolds.
Yeah, they actually implemented that now in SEAL training, where same thing. Like it's not quite as official, where it's like, if you were peer ranked by this guy, but what's going to happen is if a bunch of people say, yep, this is our lowest ranking guy, and everyone ranks him the lowest, that's going to be a problem.
Yep.
So
and it's important.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because they'll call it a spotlight ranger in Ranger school, but you can be a guy who, it's your moment to lead. You do great, but someone else is in charge, and they check on you. You're supposed to be, providing, fire security on an ambush, and you're just sleeping, because you don't care. You're not the leader that time. You think you may as well just catch up on some sleep, but you're screwing over the guy who is in charge. You're going to make him fail. And so the peer review process, plays an important role.
Definitely important. So next up, you moved from Denver to Pittsburgh, PA. What prompted that activity?
Well, I think a few things. We I think both loved Denver, and had it been probably just up to me, I would have lobbied to more strenuously to stay. But there were a few elements to it that were just tough to deal with. One is just the real estate. At that point we had our son. We were interested in having more children. We wanted to eventually live in a house as opposed to an apartment, and just looking around, there was just nothing that was affordable. And I don't want to overlook, I kind of make light of the financial challenge of this writing profession, but it was tough. I mean, I was driving Lyft, not to disparage Lyft drivers. A lot of people do it, but
not too many people with degrees from Princeton and Johns Hopkins are doing it.
That have been working. Yeah, exactly. And so, you talk about moments in basic training where you're like, how did I get here? Or why am I here? What am I doing? There were moments like that, where I'd pick, up someone at the airport and I drive. And for one thing I learned as a Lyft driver is there's some really cheap people out there. And, I would do like an hour-long drive from the airport, and the guy give like, a $2 tip or something. Jeez. And the other thing I learned, and I've asked other drivers this, and maybe there's a system that I'm not aware of, but like you don't get like that whole fare, as a driver, it seemed to me like a lot of times I'd get like, half of it, so let's say it's like a $60 drive to the airport, I might get 30, but I think what happens is the passenger thinks you get all 60. So that might be one of the reasons they don't give a big tip, because they're like, well, this guy just made $60. Well, you don't, you get like a fraction of it.
People ask me about writing books, and I always tell people all the time, do not expect to get any money from writing books. You should expect no money, because that's what 99% of chances are. You're going to write a book. It's the amount of labor that you put into it is incredible. as Tim Ferriss once pointed out, when you get done writing the book, when you get completely done writing the book, you're now 50% there, because now you have to go back and edit it and do all the other stuff that it takes to get the book out there. So it's not a great thing to get into if you're getting into it for the money. You got to write because you just want to write.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I mean, that really was a lot of it. It was just the desire to tell these stories, and in the case of the Ranger School story, even probably more so the case of the Indian relay story, I genuinely felt that these were important things, and that they shined a light on things that were worthy of people's attention, a wider audience. And the magazine writing is the most dramatic example of that. The book writing, with a decent advance, at least it gives you something. But again, you get, we mentioned the advance on the first book, that's divided into, payments that may take place over like 3 or 4 years, so whatever that number is, divide it by 4 for like an annual number, and then you take the taxes out of it, and even what would be considered like a good advance in the book world still comes out to a pretty modest amount. And that's sometimes difficult to explain to the people you're writing about, because if they're not familiar with the business of it, they're like, well, what am I getting out of this? Why would I tell you my story if you're going to be this big shot author? Well, they don't know that, like, the reality is that you're probably not going to get super rich off of this story either, and in some cases you might be making less annually than they are. So from a financial standpoint, that was part of it. It was just looking around in Denver and just kind of taking a realistic view of what can we afford to do here.
How did you select Pittsburgh?
My wife is from the West Virginia Panhandle, which is actually, people don't think of it geographically, but it's northwest of Pittsburgh. There's a little sliver of West Virginia that's northwest of Pittsburgh, and that's where she's from, about an hour away. So her family was close by. Raising a family, that was certainly part of the equation. And then Pittsburgh's also just a very affordable city. You can enjoy a quality of life there, that we couldn't elsewhere. I mean, pretty much the exact same house in the same neighborhood in Pittsburgh would be half of what it would cost in a Denver or a DC or a Boston or a city like that. So it was kind of a combination of those two factors.
So you end up writing another story, Harper's Magazine. You do a feature story in there, and this is in 2020. It's about minor league baseball. The story is called Minor Threat, which I don't know is a band. That wasn't,
so I don't do the titles on stories.
Oh, okay.
So I did get a lot of comments on that, but I wasn't the one who did that.
Okay, so, well, it's a original DC hardcore band. So I thought maybe you had some DC
and having grown up
connections.
Exactly.
Yeah, he must be
I was familiar with it, but no, that wasn't me.
So you write the story about the minor league, about the Appalachian League getting killed by the Major League Baseball. That story comes out, and that you obviously enjoyed writing it, and this leads to you putting together another book proposal.
Kind of, although the chronology was even, I think, more interesting than that, in that I had actually, when I was in Denver, I caught wind of this idea that Major League Baseball had, that we're going to cut what amounted to like 25% of our minor league teams to save an insignificant amount of money in the big scheme of things when it comes to professional sports. I think it came out to like every team they cut would save $700,000 for the major league parent, which is like one major league minimum salary. I mean, you're looking at guys now who are making, one player on the Mets last year, he was making $200,000 a game. $34 million a year, $210,000 an afternoon, so you're like, and so I just remember being struck by this, like, these are teams who in many cases had occupied an important role in these communities for like a century. And they're, some of these communities are kind of poor places. There wasn't a lot else going on in like Bluefield, West Virginia, or Pulaski, Virginia. But this one connection to the major leagues was like really special. And it was something that they really valued, and it brought a lot to the community. And I thought to myself, this isn't good. This isn't going to, it just doesn't, I don't think, speak well to the sport. And it's certainly, I don't think these communities are going to be in a better place as a result of this. And so I put together a proposal then to what it was going to be a book telling the story of what appeared to be the final season of this 100-year-old Appalachian League. And Doubleday, this editor, loved the idea. And so I had a book contract ready to go. However, if you remember, this would have been the fall of 2019.
Oh.
Well, what happened in the January of 2020? COVID.
So that final season ain't happening.
Yeah, exactly. And so I remember, checking the newspaper like obsessively that, January, February, March. And, at that time, no one really knew what was happening with COVID, what was going to stay open, what was going to shut down. I remember looking at like, well, this is a Republican state. They tend to be more open. This one's run by a Democrat governor, and they might shut down. What happens if like one state in the league, shuts its teams down, but the other one, and I was, of course, hoping that they were going to play because that was going to be my book.
Did you already get in advance?
I had already gotten. I don't think I'd been paid, but the contract had been signed, or at least it had been offered. I don't remember exactly how far we got in the. But we got to the point where we were thinking of moving from Denver to, I think at the time, Asheville, North Carolina, because I knew I was going to probably be spending the better part of the next few years somewhere doing this story. And Asheville's strategic. It's a cool town, strategically located, near all these places. I was about to get on a plane and go, look at houses, and that somewhere in that spring, word came out that MLB had canceled the whole minor league season. So now there is no season. And so my editor, who I, ultimately, we'll get to this in a minute, did do the book for, but he basically said, hey, Will, we love this idea, but, there's unfortunately no book here because there's no baseball. And so that was pretty crushing because, I went from thinking I had this amazing story that I was excited to tell to not. I did salvage it in the form of that article for Harper's, which kind of did tell the history of this league and what happened, absent the ability to spend a season down there. And luckily, thank goodness, and it's kind of serendipitous that this happened, that a guy read the article and just reached out to me through my website and said, hey, Will, what you wrote about really resonated. We have a team up here in Batavia, New York, Western New York, that like everything you describe, is kind of the same dynamic that we have. Like you should just come hang out. I'll introduce you to some people. And I thought to myself, okay, why not? It's a nice guy. It's a 4-hour drive. And I got up there and I kind of like immediately thought to myself, now this is a book. And it was kind of just a different version of that same story, in that this town had also been stripped of their team for the same reasons. There was an equally rich history and tradition, but they had stood up a collegiate team to kind of take a summer collegiate team to take the place of where this minor league team had been. And so it was kind of a story of death and what may be a rebirth of baseball in this town.
Homestand, small town baseball, and the fight for the soul of America. I'm going to read a little piece here from the introduction. You say this: the memory is always the same. My younger brother and I are in my grandparents' backyard. The grass is freshly cut because I just finished mowing the lawn under my grandfather's watchful eye before dumping some flour onto the ground to mark baselines and batter's boxes. Once the lines were marked, we would have carefully laid out the set of rubber bases our grandfather had bought for us at the nearby sporting goods store, straightening them out just so. And then we would play one-on-one baseball, employing imaginary base runners and fielders, keeping score in a spiral notebook. It was no longer a modest suburban backyard. It was Fenway Park. The Nerf ball line drives caroming off my grandpa's house were striking the green monster with a satisfying thump. Time moved with the languor unique to childhood. Fireflies flickering in the summer dusk. My grandfather watching from under a shade tree with a glass of scotch in his hand. He would occasionally heckle us good-naturedly, his Bronx accent unchanged despite being many decades removed from the old neighborhood where he'd grown up playing stickball over 50 years earlier. I am now closer to the age my grandfather was then than I am to my younger self. A kid channeling Roger Clemens, blowing fastballs by his hopelessly overmatched younger brother. These days, even the 2 years I spent playing baseball in college at Princeton have begun to fade in my mind. Yet this memory of my childhood remains pristine, somehow growing even more vivid with the passage of time. When I was young, those evenings seem as if they would stretch on forever, the sun suspended just above the horizon, never setting on our happiness. Only years after the final pitch was thrown toward the upright green wheelbarrow that served as both catcher and strike zone would I realize that the game was over, and that those magical summer evenings with my brother and grandparents were the happiest I would ever be. Ah, man. So, that's just the introduction right there. And the book, as you mentioned, the book is like the story of the Batavia Muck Dogs. Mm-hmm. And it's like a love story of baseball and a love story of America. And it's also about how, money and greed can corrupt both those things. But how the soul of America is still there.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And I think it addresses that sort of fundamental tension between, or the question of, what is baseball? And as I mentioned, hopefully as comes through in that introduction you read, I think that at least historically we've liked to believe that it's something special. It's not. It transcends business. It's our national pastime. And so, and there's kind of a romance associated with it and a historical role in kind of bringing people together, that, you can hear the sort of capitalist argument, well, this is a business, and this was a business decision, and this is $700,000. Why does the owner have to pay it if he doesn't want to? And I acknowledge that, that's America. They can do what they want. But what bothers me a little bit was the disingenuousness of, on the one hand, purporting to be something more than that, on your commercials, making, before you watch the World Series, they'll have like a Norman Rockwell kind of, picture of a kid playing catch with his dad out by the cornfield, or like the movie The Natural, and, so baseball has always kind of leveraged this sort of mythic status that we're not just a business, we're something kind of uniquely like American. But if you're going to manage it in just with like a ruthless McKinsey consulting, strategy to extract every last dime, and maybe leave 40 struggling communities in the wake of these decisions, well then you can't really pretend to not just be a business. And so that's kind of what I address in the book on a larger level. But I do it through the lens of this one community and what baseball means to this community, and in particular, like a handful of people that whose lives are in one way or another defined by this small team in this small town, and hopefully I capture kind of what is sort of magical about that, and it's distinct from professional sports and major professional sports in that it's the same people going to these games every night. The season ticket is $99. So it's like it's more of like a family reunion or a community picnic than it is going, to Petco Park, here in San Diego and spending, $100 a person, and $20 on a beer or whatever the case may be nowadays. And so I try to, sort of capture what makes it special and what we risk losing, if more of these teams go under.
Yeah. So I guess I was thinking about this when I was reading through it. I talked about the band Minor Threat. So Minor Threat was a hardcore band from Washington, D.C., and that's the scene that I grew up in, listening to that kind of music. Well, there was this huge differentiation between that kind of music and regular music, meaning that if you went to see, let's see, if it's 1985 or 1986 or 1987, and you went to see the band The Scorpions or Def Leppard, you're going to pay a bunch of money, and you were going to sit in the nosebleed seats, and you were going to watch these people perform, and then they were going to leave. And that is completely different from what I grew up with, which was you would pay $3 to go into a place that was, the size of a racquetball court, and the band would be sitting with you or standing with you at talking to you before the show. They'd get up on stage, play the show, and then they'd get right back down and start talking with you. And so you had this thing that was happening that was so much more connective, right? And everyone's sitting right there. The other thing I started thinking about was, have you heard of the sport pickleball? Mm-hmm. So pickleball is just massively popular right now. Mm-hmm. It's like one of the fastest growing sports. Mm-hmm. And I haven't played it yet, but my wife has played it. And I was like, well, why wouldn't people just play tennis? Like, what's the big deal? Well, it turns out that pickleball, when you play it, you are much closer to the other people that are playing it, and the courts are smaller. So all of a sudden, in tennis, you can't have a conversation while you're playing tennis. You'd have to literally shout. But pickleball, you can sit there and talk about the school and the school board and the potluck supper that's coming up, and you can have real conversations. And so it's much more connective. And then I started thinking about the book, this book Homestand that you wrote. It's like, oh, you're going to go to watch this game. You're going to be sitting right. You're probably going to meet the players, high five them, get their autographs, all hang out, take pictures, and then you're going to sit and you're going to talk with the people that are in your neighborhood, and you're going to watch this game and you're going to cheer them on, and you're going to have this unified thing. And man, that's a huge unifying force to rip out of these communities.
You hit on so many of the themes that I tried to bring to life. And you're absolutely right in every respect, as far as what is special about this. The connection between the players and the fans. Before every game, the players are talking to the little kids, alongside the railing, signing autographs. And these kids, they don't know the difference between Manny Machado and some, Division III college kid. He's a big, strong guy wearing a cool uniform, And the players, I think, likewise appreciate it because they're, they probably are like an obscure Division III player who's no one's probably ever asked for his autograph before, and they probably won't ever again. So it's a unique opportunity for them to feel, appreciated and to see, kids looking up to them the way they probably looked up to players, years ago. And then, just the value of bringing people together, in today's very sort of toxic political world, I think can't be underrated. In person. I tell a story in the book of different groups that otherwise probably would not, connect. There was a security guard, great guy, but looks like right out of Trump MAGA central casting, And then you have these two older ladies from Buffalo who would drive actually 45 minutes a night, for most of the summer to go to these games. It was like their thing to do, and they loved it. And it was a defining part of their existence. Very liberal, and so, you have this security guard and these two women whose paths would probably never ordinarily cross and who probably had politically very divergent views. But they united, through the Muck Dogs. He would greet them, take their ticket, they'd hug, they'd ask about each other's lives, their families, and they became close. But if the only connection between them was like, on Twitter, or on a device, they'd probably be, just shouting insults at each other. But you put them together with a common, hobby or pastime, and all of a sudden you can get beyond that. And I think that there's a real value to that sort of connectivity, and it's kind of similar to the pickleball. There's people are social creatures, and we benefit from, I think, having connections with each other.
Yeah, I'm going to read one more section of this book because it kind of plays to that a little bit. You say, I arrived in town on Memorial Day, weekend of 2022, having been told that the annual Memorial Day parade in Batavia was a big deal. The town struck me as an overtly patriotic place, one that took great pride in the numbers of Native sons and daughters who'd served in the military and in honoring those lost to war. Muck Dogs owner Robbie Nichols thought having the team march in the parade would engender goodwill in the community. When I arrived in the parking lot of the strip mall on the eastern flank of Batavia's Main Street, where the parade participants were assembling, I met the team and its manager, Joey Skip Martinez, for the first time. Shortly after I arrived, the players and the Muck Dogs dance team, comprised of local high school girls and coached by the mother of one of the players, assembled in front of the Herb City Vape Shop for a team photo. The day was gorgeous, 85 degrees with a light breeze, not a cloud in the blue sky. The players wore red and black Muck Dogs jerseys and caps along with shorts, making small talk as they got to know each other in the parking lot that was beginning to fill with marchers from other local organizations like the Boy Scouts and various church groups. As the parade slowly made its way down Main Street, The boys are back in town, blasted from the speakers of Fisher's Jeep. The manager, Skip Martinez, a natural showman, stood on the Jeep's running boards, waving to those lining the sidewalks. The parade route was lined with people of all ages, from little kids shouting, "Dewey, Dewey," trying to get the attention of the Muck Dogs mascot, to their parents and grandparents watching over them. The adjoining neighborhood featured modest home with neatly kept yards, many with American flags, some Marine Corps flags, Buffalo Bills flags, and a smattering of Trump flags. Everyone was smiling. There was an almost palpable lightness in the air, a collective exhalation after what had seemed like a relentless onslaught of bad news and divisiveness. From COVID, ensuing lockdowns, war in Ukraine, inflation, and most recently and closest to Batavia, a horrific racially motivated mass shooting just a few weeks prior that left 10 people, all of whom were black, dead in a supermarket in nearby Buffalo. The parade wrapped up at a monument to honor the Batavia men and women who had died overseas in wars. Shortly before a Memorial Day ceremony was to begin. Memorial Day had assumed more significance for me following my Iraq deployment. I had lost not one, but two good friends, and had spent my 30th birthday convoying across the Anbar Desert to a neighboring army base to let one of my best friends know that our mutual friend had been killed by a rocket-propelled grenade attack on his Humvee in Ramadi. During the ceremony, each name that was etched in the monument was read aloud and accompanied by the ring of a bell. The solemn event then concluded with the playing of taps and God Bless America. It heartened me to think that my friends who never made it back from Iraq and Afghanistan might similarly be remembered.
Yeah, there's something special there, and I think it discovering this community and what baseball brought to it did kind of bring a piece to me that I didn't expect, and it certainly went beyond what I had set out to write this book about. You know, initially it was kind of more about, you know, what does this say about our society, you know, the direction that we're headed, you know, the future of baseball, business, things like that. But on a personal level, what was even more surprising was just kind of the sense of tranquility that I found in the ballpark, surrounded by these people. And I think in different ways, a lot of the people there were discovering something similar. You know, they're coming from different backgrounds. They didn't all have military experience, but everyone has different challenges in their lives. And I think there was something kind of magical in the air, you know, so to speak, that kept them coming back. And that, again, you know, just sort of speaks to the importance of this kind of an institution in towns like this. And then, you know, the only other element to that, I think that I would add would be, to the bad news part. You know, there were a few instances where I would feel this sense of sort of peace, and then I'd look at my iPhone and I'd see whatever the bad news of the day was, you know, just streaming across social media, you know, and, you know, let's say it was like a mass shooting, for example, you know, and those are obviously disturbing events, but I'd have to step back. I'd say, wait a second, like, I'm in Batavia, New York. I'm in a beautiful ballpark surrounded by nice people, the beautiful sun setting. Do I really, like, how does it improve my life to be constantly 24 hours a day connected to every bad thing that's happening anywhere in the world? You know, it's never been like, 100 years ago it wasn't like this. 200 years ago, if you lived in Batavia, the only bad news, you know, generally speaking, the only bad news that you're going to be exposed to is what happened in Batavia that day. And most days there probably wasn't anything that bad. It's not like, you know, a massacre in, you know, Mozambique took place and that's going to ruin your day in Batavia. And so I think for people's mental health, there's certainly a benefit to being able to, it's not saying just to become, you know, ignorant to what's going on in the world, and just, you know, kind of being an ostrich and putting your head in the sand. But at the same time, maybe just kind of throttling back our exposure to every news story from every corner of the globe that's just going to depress us or anger us. And when there's algorithms that are actually actively designed to prey on that exact anger to keep you, subconsciously wanting more of it, And so, the two happiest people that I've met, probably in the last 10 years in this, were during the course of this book. And the one common feature that they had was they didn't even own a flip phone, much less an iPhone. And I say this as an addict, and I fully recognize that. So I'm not holier than thou, but I think I do at least, what's the first step to recognizing the first step to recovery is recognizing you have a problem. And, I think one of the things I'm going to try to do is take a step in that direction, because these guys, just their general contentment was something that I think a lot of us are missing. And I think there's something to the fact that they weren't just drowning in sensational stories 24 hours a day.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about as I was reading some of the sections of the book was, I get interviewed a decent amount, and sometimes I get interviewed by people that are like just at ground zero of political conflict. And when you talk to them, like, they believe that that's what's happening. They believe that what happens on Twitter is the way people are out interacting. Like when that's what discussions are like right now in America. And I always, I have a leadership consulting company, and I travel around the country and out of the country, but most of it's here in America. But I travel to like the most random places to work with companies. I go out on oil rigs and construction sites and manufacturing plants, and so I'm with people all the time. And I have to say, like, that normal people are not like that. Normal people are not going crazy. Normal people are not screaming at each other. Normal people are not insulting each other. And what also this made me think of is, when you've got these two people from disparate worlds and they come together to watch a ball game and they get humanized, it reminds me so much of The Prisoner in His Palace, when you've got these young soldiers. And believe me, there's enough propaganda when you're a young soldier that you will hate Saddam Hussein. But for them to spend time with this guy, an evil person, and yet they develop, he at least at a minimum becomes humanized in their eyes. Look, none of them thought about breaking him out, right? There was no one that said, hey, we need to step in and save. There's no one thought that, but they at least saw him as a human being. And so if you can take soldiers that are trained and propagandized to hate someone that in their mind is the absolute enemy, and they can and an 18-year-old kid can become humanized, can humanize this evil person. It's like, yeah, maybe if you actually went to a little field somewhere and sat in some bleachers with some people and ate a hot dog and cheered on your team and sat next to someone that had that same, goal in mind, you might just find that you can get along and you can move forward.
Yeah. And it's there's something, beautiful about that. And it's particularly beautiful when you get depressed by thinking that that's not what's going on, and then you see it and you see this little, example of that sort of blossoming, and you're like, this is, to use the military, this is like what right looks like, this is what we need more of. And instead it's what we're getting rid of, which is kind of the irony of the book.
Craziness. Well, I haven't finished the book yet, but so far it's just a great read. So awesome work there. What's the next project? Do you know yet?
I'm working with my editor. Don't know for sure what it's going to be. I have some ideas, but nothing that's come to fruition yet. I mean, this was completed not long ago, so our focus is on this one for now. But I'm certainly in the market for good ideas for the next one.
And Homestand is available. What, March 11th is launch date?
March 11th next.
So it'll be out.
Week.
It'll be out when this comes out. Yeah. So
Correct.
You can go to wherever you buy your books, and you can order Homestand for a very nice look at America and where we should be heading. Does that get us up to speed? Anything else?
No, that's it. I don't know if you want to. I'm doing a little work right now with the Afghanistan War Commission. I don't know if you want to go down that road.
Yeah.
It's up to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a congressionally established commission. Was stood up about a year ago. bipartisan, with certain representatives selected by Republicans, some by Democrats, a co-chair that's was selected by Republican and Democrat, and essentially tasked with providing an objective and impartial account of our 20 years in Afghanistan, and beginning with 9/11 and the horse soldiers, special forces guys that went in immediately thereafter, and concluding with Afghans hanging off the back of C-17s as Kabul fell to the Taliban, and kind of asking the hard questions of how did we start here and end here, what missteps did we make along the way, and most importantly what can we learn from this, and hopefully avoid repeating some of these mistakes in the future. So that's something that I'll be working on for probably the better part of the next year, and then they're going to issue a report that's going to kind of in some sense be similar to, I don't know if you remember the 9/11 Commission report. That was a similar commission that was established to kind of figure out, okay, well, how did this happen, and how can we avoid another 9/11? That's kind of that report is kind of analogous to the report that we hope to produce, to hopefully shed some more light on the 20 years that we spent over there.
Any early assessments? Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I can't get into too much detail. I will say that everything I'll say about it is my own opinion, not that of the commission, because I'm a writer. I'm not even one of the commissioners. So essentially, I'm just helping them to hopefully produce something that is readable and compelling, and will kind of we have a dual objective in that we were tasked by Congress to do this. So policymakers are like one audience. People in a position to make some of these decisions moving forward to help inform them. But I think we also want the American public to see this and to hopefully have an opportunity to read it. And in order to make that happen, it has to be something that is at least moderately readable.
Better than your first draft.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't want them to have a viscerally negative reaction. And that's kind of why I'm there, is to help do that.
Yeah, have you ever read the book About Face by Colonel David Hackworth?
I know that you're a fan of it, but I haven't read it. No.
It's really kind of disturbing. I would read it all the time. I've read it a bunch of times. I read it so many times I can't even count. But in Iraq, in Ramadi, in my first deployment, I read it as well, but things weren't developed as much. But when I was in Ramadi, I would just to go to bed at night, I would just open it up and read like 3 pages, and it's just so ridiculous how the things that they were going through, especially in Vietnam, but a little bit of Korea as well, how no lessons learned, just no lessons learned. And it would be so frustrating to think, here he is, he's working with the Vietnamese. They were corrupt. They couldn't be trusted. They, it's just like, oh, there's one little thing. Oh, and who's getting how are you dying over there? How are you dying in Vietnam? How's Americans getting killed? Oh, they're getting killed from booby traps, indirect fire, and snipers. It's the exact same thing. And there was just lesson after lesson after lesson. And then you get the fake kill counts, right? Because that's how they were monitoring the war. And it's like, well, we killed this many enemy. And then, you get to Iraq or Afghanistan, it's like, well, we trained this many of our partner force and they're now qualified to do this type of mission. And, oh, the acts of violence are going down. It's like, no, they're just lying up the chain of command. And so you'd see this stuff and it's just awful. It's absolutely awful. And, I hope that you guys can publish a report that paints this stuff out. And I hope that it's actually things that you can learn from, because I'm not sure, I look at, when you think about capitalism, right? So in capitalism, if Echo Charles wants to make money, Echo Charles creates an idea, and then he has to really drive that idea forward. He has to create that thing. He's got to work to make it. Once he makes that widget, he's got to get it out there and market it, and then he can be rewarded for that. So it takes a personal initiative to make things happen. And the military, unfortunately, has an aspect to it, which is, it's kind of like I said earlier. Oh, well, I'm replacing Will. You're a battalion commander, and I'm replacing you. I'm going to make sure that my battalion does a little bit more than yours did. And it's okay because you're behind me, so I'm coming in now, and so I'm going to make sure that my reports, when they go up, and you trained, 2 companies of Iraqi soldiers. Well, I'm going to make it 3 companies of Iraqi soldiers. And then when the next guy comes, he makes it 5. Well, none of us trained any. We trained the same ones over and over again. It doesn't really matter. It's all a lie. And for me to make something happen, well, I'll show a lot of initiative to make something happen, but it's not strategic. It's not even a strategic effort. And so some of those lessons that we failed to learn after Vietnam, I hope that you can capture some of them in this report, that the people that are working on it can capture them.
I absolutely. I mean, the Vietnam analogy is a powerful one. I mean, you look at Robert McNamara's book, what is it, In Retrospect?
Yep.
Same thing. I mean, he concludes with like 10 lessons. And, you look at those lessons and you look at then what we've done over the last 20 years and you think to yourself, well, how in the world, he laid it out right here. And, yet we tend to repeat them. And, to the military, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but, we all saw that, you get to an area and inevitably, you have, what are they used to, there used to be the pie charts, right? Like green, amber, red, and inevitably, the outgoing unit would say everything's kind of green and amber, and then you take over and you're like, actually it's red, and then by the end of your year, magically it's amber and green again, and part of that's just human nature. Leaders don't want to step back and be like, what, things are like worse now than they were when we got here. But I think at some point, I wish the military needs to find a way to reward candor, even if it means acknowledging that things aren't looking that good, and oftentimes the truth is that they might not be looking good through no fault of anyone who's there doing their best. But no one benefits from them glossing over those challenges, and I think that's where a lot of problems develop is this tendency we have to want to show progress, and to not acknowledge that there may be strategic challenges that are no one's fault, but they need to be recognized, because if you don't recognize them, you're not making any progress, despite what you'd like to tell people.
Yeah, I'm very looking forward to reading this report, and if it doesn't have some candor in it, I'm going hot. Right on. Anything else? Any other projects you're working on?
No, just the other projects, just raising our 2 kids, which is probably the most challenging project of all.
No doubt about it. Probably a good place to stop then. So people can find you. You've got an interwebs website, which is willbardenwerper.com. You're on Twitter. Twitter X is what I call it, at W Bardenwerper. You got Facebook, Will Bardenwerper, and you got Instagram, which one of these you're not very active on.
Instagram's mostly just, family pictures, nothing too exciting on there.
And then you got a Substack, which didn't look hyperactive.
No, that was kind of a diary of my book research. And now that the book research is over, the diary is pretty much over. Well, so I would refer people to the book as opposed to the diary.
Okay. So, and the book is available wherever you get your books. And how active? It looked like you were semi-active on Twitter X.
Yeah, I'm reasonably active on there. So yeah, that's not a bad follow.
Right on. Awesome. Echo Charles.
Yes.
You have any questions?
Quick question.
Baseball questions, football questions. What do we got?
Actually, your most recent project, your kids. Do you have any strong opinions about them joining the military when they get older?
Oh, the military. My wife jokes that I'm in the process of brainwashing my son to go to an academy because it's free. And so every time we have family in Connecticut, and so like West Point's kind of like right on our path, and she's like, "How come every time you're driving to Connecticut, you find yourself on the West Point campus?" And I have friends that went there, and so I've became close to them. I go to the Army Navy game a lot, and so I would certainly not be opposed to it, but at the same time, I also have my eyes open to the fact that it's a real commitment, and the world is not a stable place, and it can I certainly would not actually want to pressure someone to do something and then have them sent off to do something that maybe wasn't in his or the country's best interest. So I recognize that it's a real decision, but yeah, we at least half jokingly talk about my my encouraging him to consider an academy.
Any other questions, Echo Charles?
That's it.
Will, any closing thoughts?
No, I appreciate you having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming down, man. Thanks for sharing these lessons and these stories that you got, and thanks for your service. Thanks for your sacrifice. Another fellow member of the 11 AD, and thanks for what you're continuing to do today to share your thoughts, share your words, and hopefully they will make and allow people to see the world a little bit more clearly.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And with that, Will Bardenwerper has left the building. Definitely a interesting voyage he's been on. And I recommend everyone go on an interesting voyage in life. When you're on the voyage, you need fuel.
Sure.
We collectively recommend Jocko Fuel. Check out jockofuel.com. We got what you need. We got ready to drink protein, powder protein. We got energy drink. We got pre-workout. We got greens. We got everything that you need. We got the super krill oil. We got the joint warfare. We got the time war. We got everything that you need. Go to jockofuel.com. Check it out. You can also get it at a bunch of retail places across the country. Walmart, Wawa, Vitamin Shop, GNC, military commissaries. You can get it at AFES. You can get it at Hanford, Dash Stores. You can get it at Wakefern, ShopRite, HEB down in Texas, Meijer in the Midwest, Wegmans, Harris Teeter, Publix down south, and then Lifetime Fitness, Shields, and then a bunch of small gyms all over the place, whichever one you might be in. And if they don't have it at your small gym, tell them to email jfsales@jockofuel.com. Get creatine too, by the way. Are you dry scooping creatine?
No, wet scooping all day.
What do you do?
I
what do you mix it with?
Hydrate and water and create. So hydrate, water, creatine, boom, in 16 ounces.
Morning
of water.
or night?
Morning, all day.
How much creatine?
Like what the equivalent, my estimate, which varies
Oh, that's right.
anywhere from 50 to 100% variation. 5 grams of creatine.
Check. I'm just so you know. Look, you can take this and do what you want with it. I'm on morning and night 5 grams.
No.
Yeah. So just so you know what's happening over on my side of the table.
So you're on that eternal loading phase.
Yes, I'm loading for real.
So morning and night.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what we're doing.
Okay.
Just FYI. So check it out, jockofuel.com. Just got back from the Arnold's. Did you have fun at the Arnold's?
Yes, we did.
It's chaos, huh?
It was chaos. Better and better, for sure.
It's chaos because you have like strongman, fireman strongman, Olympic lifting, bodybuilding, jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai. Like it's all going down there.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
You like it because it's like a good
It's my people.
It's
my people.
They're over there just talking about supersets.
Hey, look. I like it all. When you think about it, name everything.
Yeah, everything
I like it all.
Is all good. Yeah.
I like it all. A sprinkle of everything. Like I'm not like some hardcore bodybuilder, but if you look in we'll say traditional bodybuilding, let's say workout routine, there's going to be some of that sprinkled into my workout routine. Maybe a lot of it. I don't know.
You got that jiu-jitsu too.
Jiu-jitsu, same thing. Power strongman, same exact thing.
Just physical culture. You're just down for the cause, huh?
Any fitness culture for sure. I'm down for the cause, 100%.
Check.
Not to mention, a lot of. It's interesting. You get to see all the characters that you kind of see on the internet most of the time. That's a fun little deal, man.
Yeah,
100%.
It's pretty awesome. So check that out. We were there. Jocko Fuel was there in force. Also, we mentioned jiu-jitsu. Look, you can do jiu-jitsu. We recommend you do jiu-jitsu. Could I mandate it? Technically speaking, no, I can't force you to do jiu-jitsu. But here's why I'm bringing this up. I met a guy that was. He said, "Hey, I've been listening to the podcast for 8 years. I've been training jiu-jitsu for 2." I said, "It took us 6 years to convince you." He goes, "Yeah, I'm lame." That's a real thing, dude. Like, if we're talking about jiu-jitsu so much, there's a reason. It's going to help you in every aspect of your life. Train jiu-jitsu. If you're going to train jiu-jitsu, which you should, you need a jiu-jitsu gi. OriginUSA.com. Get the best gi that you can possibly get and get it made in America. Also, you need a rash guard. Get an American-made rash guard. By the way, you can't wear your rash guard unless you're Donahair. You can't wear it out like to town. You're going to need a hoodie. You're going to need a t-shirt. You're going to need a pair of jeans. You're going to need a pair of boots. You can all that stuff, 100% American-made at OriginUSA.com. So go check that out. That's my recommendation.
It's true. Look good, feel good about everything, by the way. Also, Jocko's store called Jocko Store. This is where you can get your apparel. if you want to represent on this path, this voyage.
Yeah, we're doing a voyage today. Not
Voyages,
just the path.
paths, journeys, the whole deal. If you want to represent, this is where you can get your apparel. Got a lot of shirts on there, but we also have hats and hoodies, some shorts on there. We got a lot of good stuff on there.
I saw the no drinking one, the Dos Equis one.
Dos Equis.
Dos
Yeah.
Equis.
Yeah. When did you see it?
Dave Burke was wearing it.
Good deal, dude.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was wearing it the other day.
Dave, he expressed to me that he was a fan of the deal. like specially. You see what I'm saying? So yeah, it landed. Good. Yeah, it was a good one. That's part of what we call the shirt locker. It's a subscription scenario. You got a new design every month. Every month you get a new design.
There you go.
It's all on jockostore.com. So yeah, check that one out.
Right on. Speaking of steak. We
Sure.
were speaking
Yeah,
of steak,
no,
but it's
no.
all good. Hey, check out ColoradoCraftBeef.com. Check out PrimalBeef.com. This is where you should get your steak. It's where you should get your beef jerky. It's where you should get your meat sticks. It's where you should get your burgers, your hot dogs. Just get your protein. You're gonna need some of it. PrimalBeef.com, ColoradoCraftBeef.com. Awesome steak from awesome people. Check it out. Also subscribe to this podcast. Also subscribe to Jocko Underground. Also check out the YouTube channels. Origin USA, Jocko Podcast Official.
Yep.
And Jocko Fuel. Lots of stuff going on those things. Psychological Warfare. Check that out on the MP3 if you haven't checked it out yet. And then books. Obviously the books we reviewed today were looked at today. Prisoner's Palace and Homestand by Will Bardenwerper. Freaking cool books. Check them out. The Prisoner's Palace. Such a weird thing to read about, dude.
It's deep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an intriguing concept in general.
Mm-hmm.
There's a name for kind of that. It's called something Nightingale something. It's like I think they call it a syndrome, but it's like when basically
yes.
It's like it's different than that because that's different, but it's almost in the same vein where it's like that when you basically create a relationship with a person who like kidnapped you or something like that.
Yeah, Stockholm Syndrome.
Stockholm, is that what it is? Okay.
That's the OG one, I'm pretty sure off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Because there was,
But it's weird how that works because you know how like recently I've been telling you there's more like there can be two things that are true at the same time even though they really feel and seem mutually exclusive. You know, like, hey, this guy is an evil person. How can you like an evil person when you're not an evil person? In fact, that's kind of your enemy. You're guarding them in the prison. Like it's impossible.
For crimes against humanity.
Again, literally against humanity.
Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
right. Like how can you like someone like that?
Yeah.
But it's like, bro, two things can be true at the same time once you kind of like explore them, you know? Yeah, it gets deep. But yeah.
No, it's definitely an interesting book to read. So check that out. Also, I've written a bunch of books. Adult books, leadership books, novels, books about discipline, and a bunch of kids' books that will help your kid completely get on the path and become a better human being. Also, Echelon Front, we have a leadership consultancy. We solve problems through leadership. The next big event that we have is Battlefield. Out there, we're going to walk the battlefield, the Gettysburg battlefield. We're going to walk the Gettysburg battlefield, and we are going to go through the lessons learned from a detached perspective while we're out there on hallowed ground. Unbelievable experience. Also, we have the muster in San Antonio, April 29th through May 1st. This is a epic event. It's going to be down there in San Antonio. In Tejas, we are going to really be able to transfer the skills of leadership in a powerful way. So if you want to send some of your team down there, you want to come down there, go to echelonfront.com for details on that. We also have the online Extreme Ownership Academy where we teach these skills of leadership online. Go to extremeownership.com if you want to become a better human being, just better human being. And check that out. And if you want to help service members, active and retired, you want to help their families, you want to help Gold Star families, check out Mark Lee's mom, Mama Lee. She's got an amazing charity organization, helps so many of our veterans and their families. If you want to donate or you want to get involved, go to americasmightywarriors.org. Also check out Micah Fink, And he's got his organization, heroesandhorses.org. And finally, Jimmy May's organization, beyondthebrotherhood.org. All great organizations, charities that can help out so many people. Finally, if you want to connect with us, for Will, he's on the interwebs. WillBardenwerper.com. And you can find him on Twitter, X, at W Bardenwerper. WBARDENWERPER. And for us, you can check out Jocko.com. And on social media, I'm on there at Jocko Willink. Echo's at Echo Charles. Just be careful, because there's people on there that just going to use your own hate to make you scroll more and stay on it more. They'll make you mad so you stay there more. This is not good for you. It's not healthy for you. If you're scrolling through that stuff and you're getting angry, it's a problem. So be careful. And thanks once again to Will for joining us. Thanks for your service in combat for America. And thanks for what you do today to help people better understand the world. Thanks to all the uniform personnel out there, with a special thanks to the U.S. Army's 136, 1st Battalion, 36th Infantry, the Spartans, for what you all have done to take the fight to the enemy when you were up the road from us in heat while we were down there in Ramadi, covering our flank. Thank you. Also, thanks to our police, law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, dispatchers, correctional officers, Border Patrol, Secret Service, all first responders. Thank you for taking to the streets to fight crime and corruption here at home. And everyone else out there, you know, the 136 Infantry, they're the Spartans. And they have a motto. And that motto is deeds, not words. Deeds, not words. That means don't talk about it. Do it. No matter how hard it's going to be, no matter what challenges you're going to face, no matter what your feelings are at the moment, no matter what your inner voice is telling you, regardless of all that, go out there and do the deed. Deeds, not words. And that's all we've got for tonight. And until next time, this is Echo and Jocko out.